Invention of Nature, The Adventures of Alexander von Humboldt, The Lost Hero of Science, by Andrea Wolf. Read.
Close your eyes, prick your ears, and from the softest sound to the wildest noise, from the simplest tone to the highest harmony, from the most violent, passionate scream to the gentlest words of sweet reason, it is by Nature who speaks, revealing her being, her power, her life, and her relatedness, so that a blind person to whom the infinitely visible world is denied can grasp an infinite vitality in what can be heard. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Prologue. They were crawling on hands and knees along a high, narrow ridge that was in places only 2 inches wide. The path, if you could call it that, was layered with sand and loose stones that shifted whenever touched. Down to the left was a steep cliff encrusted with ice that glinted when the sun broke through the thick clouds. The view to the right, with a 1,000-foot drop, wasn't much better. Here the dark, almost perpendicular walls were covered with rocks that protruded like knife blades. Alexander von Humboldt and his 3 companions moved in single file, slowly inching forward. Without proper equipment or appropriate clothes, this was a dangerous climb. The icy wind had numbed their hands and feet, melted snow had soaked their thin shoes, and ice crystals clung to their hair and beards. At 17,000 feet above sea level, they struggled to breathe in the thin air. As they proceeded, the jagged rocks shredded the soles of their shoes, and their feet began to bleed. It was June 23, 1802, and they were climbing Chimborazo, a beautiful dome-shaped inactive volcano in the Andes that rose to almost 21,000 feet, some 100 miles to the south of Quito, in today's Ecuador. Chimborazo was then believed to be the highest mountain in the world. No wonder that their terrified porters had abandoned them at the snow line. The volcano's peak was shrouded in thick fog, but Humboldt had nonetheless pressed on. For the previous 3 years, Alexander von Humboldt had been traveling through Latin America, penetrating deep into lands where few Europeans had ever gone before. Obsessed with scientific observation, the 32-year-old had brought a vast array of the best instruments from Europe. For the ascent of Chimborazo, he had left most of the baggage behind, but had packed a barometer, a thermometer, a sextant, an artificial horizon, and a so-called cyanometer, with which he could measure the blueness of the sky. As they climbed, Humboldt fumbled out his instruments with numb fingers, setting them upon precariously narrow ledges to measure altitude, gravity, and humidity. He meticulously listed any species encountered. Here a butterfly, there a tiny flower. Everything was recorded in his notebook. At 18,000 feet, they saw a last scrap of lichen clinging to a boulder. After that, all signs of organic life disappeared, because at that height there were no plants or insects. Even the condors that had accompanied their previous climbs were absent. As the fog whitewashed the air into an eerie, empty space, Humboldt felt completely removed from the inhabited world. It was, he said, as if we were trapped inside an air balloon. Then, suddenly, the fog lifted, revealing Chimborazo's snow-capped summit against the blue sky. A magnificent sight was Humboldt's first thought. But then he saw the huge crevasse in front of them, 65 feet wide and about 600 feet deep. But there was no other way to the top. When Humboldt measured their altitude at 19,413 feet, he discovered that they were barely 1,000 feet below the peak. No one had ever come this high before, and no one had ever breathed such thin air. As he stood at the top of the world, looking down upon the mountain ranges folded beneath him, Humboldt began to see the world differently. He saw the earth as one great living organism, where everything was connected, conceiving a bold new vision of nature that still influences the way that we understand the natural world. Described by his contemporaries as the most famous man in the world after Napoleon, Humboldt was one of the most captivating and inspiring men of his time. Born in 1769 into a wealthy Prussian aristocratic family, he discarded a life of privilege to discover for himself how the world worked. As a young man, he set out on a 5-year exploration to Latin America, risking his life many times and returning with a new sense of the world. It was a journey that shaped his life and thinking, and that made him legendary across the globe. He lived in cities such as Paris and Berlin, but was equally at home on the most remote branches of the Orinoco River or in the Kazakh steppe at Russia's Mongolian border. During much of his long life, he was the nexus of the scientific world, writing some 50,000 letters and receiving at least double that number. Knowledge, Humboldt believed, had to be shared, exchanged, and made available to everybody. He was also a man of contradictions. He was a fierce critic of colonialism and supported the revolutions in Latin America, yet was chamberlain to 2 Prussian kings. He admired the United States for their concepts of liberty and equality, but never stopped criticizing their failure to abolish slavery. He called himself half an American, but at the same time compared America to a Cartesian vortex, carrying away and leveling everything to a dull monotony. He was confident, yet constantly yearned for approval. He was admired for his breadth of knowledge, but also feared for his sharp tongue. Humboldt's books were published in a dozen languages and were so popular that people bribed booksellers to be the first to receive copies, yet he died a poor man. He could be vain, but would also give his last money to a struggling young scientist. He packed his life with travels and incessant work. He always wanted to experience something new and, as he said, ideally, 3 things at the same time. Humboldt was celebrated for his knowledge and scientific thinking, yet he was no cerebral scholar. Not content in his study or among books, he threw himself into physical exertion, pushing his body to its limits. He ventured deep into the mysterious world of the rainforest in Venezuela and crawled along narrow rock ledges at a precarious height in the Andes to see the flames inside an active volcano. Even as a 60-year-old, he traveled more than 10,000 miles to the remotest corners of Russia, outpacing his younger companions. Fascinated by scientific instruments, measurements, and observations, he was driven by a sense of wonder as well. Of course, nature had to be measured and analyzed, but he also believed that a great part of our response to the natural world should be based on the senses and emotions. He wanted to excite a love of nature. At a time when other scientists were searching for universal laws, Humboldt wrote that nature had to be experienced through feelings. Humboldt was unlike anybody else because he was able to remember even the smallest details for years: the shape of a leaf, the color of soil, a temperature reading, the layering of a rock. This extraordinary memory allowed him to compare the observations he had made all over the world, several decades or thousands of miles apart. Humboldt was able to run through the chain of all phenomena in the world at the same time, one colleague later said. Where others had to ransack their memories, Humboldt, whose eyes are natural telescopes and microscopes, as the American writer and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson said in admiration, had every morsel of knowledge and observation to hand at an instant. As he stood on Chimborazo, exhausted by the climb, Humboldt absorbed the view. Here, vegetation zones were stacked, one on top of the other. In the valleys, he had passed through palms and humid bamboo forests where colorful orchids clung to the trees. Further up, he had seen conifers, oaks, alders, and shrub-like berberis, similar to those he knew from European forests. Then had come alpine plants, much like those he had collected in the mountains in Switzerland, and lichens that reminded him of specimens from the Arctic Circle and Lapland. No one had looked at plants like this before. Humboldt saw them not through the narrow categories of classification, but as types according to their location and climate. Here was a man who viewed nature as a global force with corresponding climate zones across continents, a radical concept at the time, and one that still colors our understanding of ecosystems. Humboldt's books, diaries, and letters reveal a visionary, a thinker far ahead of his time. He invented isotherms, the lines of temperature and pressure that we see on today's weather maps, and he also discovered the magnetic equator. He came up with the idea of vegetation and climate zones that snake across the globe. Most important, though, Humboldt revolutionized the way we see the natural world. He found connections everywhere. Nothing, not even the tiniest organism, was looked at on its own. In this great chain of causes and effects, Humboldt said, no single fact can be considered in isolation. With this insight, he invented the web of life, the concept of nature as we know it today. When nature is perceived as a web, its vulnerability also becomes obvious. Everything hangs together. If one thread is pulled, the whole tapestry may unravel. After he saw the devastating environmental effects of colonial plantations at Lake Valencia in Venezuela in 1800, Humboldt became the first scientist to talk about harmful human-induced climate change. Deforestation there had made the land barren. Water levels of the lake were falling, and with the disappearance of brushwood, torrential rains had washed away the soils on the surrounding mountain slopes. Humboldt was the first to explain the forest's ability to enrich the atmosphere with moisture and its cooling effect, as well as its importance for water retention and protection against soil erosion. He warned that humans were meddling with the climate, and that this could have an unforeseeable impact on future generations. The invention of nature traces the invisible threads that connect us to this extraordinary man. Humboldt influenced many of the greatest thinkers, artists, and scientists of his day. Thomas Jefferson called him one of the greatest ornaments of the age. Charles Darwin wrote that nothing ever stimulated my zeal so much as reading Humboldt's personal narrative, saying that he would not have boarded the Beagle nor conceived of the origin of species without Humboldt. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge both incorporated Humboldt's concept of nature into their poems, and America's most revered nature writer, Henry David Thoreau, found in Humboldt's books an answer to his dilemma on how to be a poet and a naturalist. Walden would have been a very different book without Humboldt. Simón Bolívar, the revolutionary who liberated South America from Spanish colonial rule, called Humboldt the discoverer of the New World. And Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Germany's greatest poet, declared that spending a few days with Humboldt was like having lived several years. On September 14, 1869, 100 years after his birth, Alexander von Humboldt's centennial was celebrated across the world. There were parties in Europe, Africa, and Australia, as well as the Americas. In Melbourne and Adelaide, people came together to listen to speeches in honor of Humboldt, as did groups in Buenos Aires and Mexico City. There were festivities in Moscow, where Humboldt was called the Shakespeare of Sciences, and in Alexandria in Egypt, where guests partied under a sky illuminated with fireworks. The greatest commemorations were in the United States, where from San Francisco to Philadelphia and from Chicago to Charleston, the nation saw street parades, sumptuous dinners, and concerts. In Cleveland, some 8,000 people took to the streets, and in Syracuse, another 15,000 joined a march that was more than a mile long. President Ulysses Grant attended the Humboldt celebrations in Pittsburgh, together with 10,000 revelers, who brought the city to a standstill. In New York City, the cobbled streets were lined with flags. City Hall was veiled in banners, and entire houses had vanished behind huge posters bearing Humboldt's face. Even the ships sailing by, out on the Hudson River, were garlanded in colorful bunting. In the morning, thousands of people followed 10 music bands, marching from the Bowery and along Broadway to Central Park to honor a man whose fame no nation can claim, as the New York Times's front page reported. By early afternoon, 25,000 onlookers had assembled in Central Park to listen to the speeches as a large bronze bust of Humboldt was unveiled. In the evening, as darkness settled, a torchlight procession of 15,000 people set out along the streets, walking beneath colorful Chinese lanterns. "Let us imagine him," one speaker said, "as standing on the Andes, with his mind soaring above all." Every speech across the world emphasized that Humboldt had seen an inner correlation between all aspects of nature. In Boston, Emerson told the city's grandees that Humboldt was one of those wonders of the world. His fame, the Daily News in London reported, was in some sort bound up with the universe itself. In Germany, there were festivities in Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, Frankfurt, and many other cities. The greatest German celebrations were in Berlin, Humboldt's hometown, where despite torrential rain, 80,000 people assembled. The authorities had ordered offices and all government agencies to close for the day. As the rain poured down and gusts chilled the air, the speeches and singing nonetheless continued for hours. Though today almost forgotten outside academia, at least in the English-speaking world, Alexander von Humboldt's ideas still shape our thinking. And while his books collect dust in libraries, his name lingers everywhere, from the Humboldt Current running along the coast of Chile and Peru, to dozens of monuments, parks, and mountains in Latin America, including Sierra Humboldt in Mexico and Pico Humboldt in Venezuela. A town in Argentina, a river in Brazil, a geyser in Ecuador, and a bay in Colombia, all are named after Humboldt. There are Cap Humboldt and Humboldt Glacier in Greenland, as well as mountain ranges in northern China, South Africa, New Zealand, and Antarctica. There are rivers and waterfalls in Tasmania and New Zealand, as well as parks in Germany and Rue Alexandre de Humboldt in Paris. In North America alone, 4 counties, 13 towns, mountains, bays, lakes, and a river are named after him, as well as the Humboldt Redwood State Park in California and Humboldt Parks in Chicago and Buffalo. The state of Nevada was almost called Humboldt when the Constitutional Convention debated its name in the 1860s. Almost 300 plants and more than 100 animals are named after him, including the Californian Humboldt lily, Lilium Humboldtii, the South American Humboldt penguin, Spheniscus humboldti, and the fierce predatory 6-foot Humboldt squid, Dositicus gigas, which can be found in the Humboldt Current. Several minerals carry his name, from Humboldtit to Humboldton, and on the Moon there is an area called Mare Humboldtianum. More places are named after Humboldt than anyone else. Ecologists, environmentalists, and nature writers rely on Humboldt's vision, although most do so unknowingly. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is based on Humboldt's concept of interconnectedness, and scientist James Lovelock's famous Gaia theory of the Earth as a living organism bears remarkable similarities. When Humboldt described the Earth as a natural whole animated and moved by inward forces, he predated Lovelock's ideas by more than 150 years. Humboldt called his book describing this new concept Cosmos, having initially considered but then discarded Gaia as a title. We are shaped by the past. Nicholas Copernicus showed us our place in the universe. Isaac Newton explained the laws of nature. Thomas Jefferson gave us some of our concepts of liberty and democracy, and Charles Darwin proved that all species descend from common ancestors. These ideas define our relationship to the world. Humboldt gave us our concept of nature itself. The irony is that Humboldt's views have become so self-evident that we have largely forgotten the man behind them. But there exists a direct line of connection through his ideas and through the many people whom he inspired. Like a rope, Humboldt's concept of nature connects us to him. The Invention of Nature is my attempt to find Humboldt. It has been a journey across the world that led me to archives in California, Berlin, and Cambridge, among many others. I read through thousands of letters, but I also followed Humboldt's footsteps. I saw the ruin of the Anatomy Tower in Jena in Germany, where Humboldt spent many weeks dissecting animals, and at 12,000 feet on the Antisana in Ecuador, with 4 condors circling above and surrounded by a herd of wild horses, I found the dilapidated hut where he had spent a night in March 1802. In Quito, I held Humboldt's original Spanish passport in my hands, the very papers that allowed him to travel through Latin America. In Berlin, I finally understood how his mind worked when I opened the boxes that contained his notes, marvelous collages of thousands of bits of paper, sketches, and numbers. Closer to home, at the British Library in London, I spent many weeks reading Humboldt's published books, some so huge and heavy that I could scarcely lift them onto the table. In Cambridge, I looked at Darwin's own copies of Humboldt's books, those that Darwin had kept on a shelf next to his hammock on the Beagle. They are filled with Darwin's pencil marks. Reading these books was like eavesdropping on Darwin talking to Humboldt. I found myself lying at night in the Venezuelan rainforest, listening to the strange bellowing cry of howler monkeys, but also stuck in Manhattan without electricity during Hurricane Sandy when I had traveled there to read some documents in the New York Public Library. I admired the old manor house with its 10th-century tower in the little village of Piabazi outside Turin, where George Perkins Marsh wrote parts of Man and Nature in the early 1860s, a book inspired by Humboldt's ideas, and one that would mark the beginning of America's conservation movement. I walked around Thoreau's Walden Pond in deep, freshly fallen snow, and hiked in Yosemite, reminding myself of John Muir's idea that the clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness. The most exciting moment was when I finally climbed Chimborazo, the mountain that had been so elemental to Humboldt's vision. As I walked up the barren slope, the air was so thin that every step felt like an eternity, a slow pull upward, while my legs felt leaden and somehow disconnected from the rest of my body. My admiration for Humboldt grew with every step. He had climbed Chimborazo with an injured foot, and certainly not in walking boots as comfortable and sturdy as mine, loaded with instruments, and constantly stopping to take measurements. The result of this exploration through landscapes and letters, through thoughts and diaries, is this book. The Invention of Nature is my quest to rediscover Humboldt, and to restore him to his rightful place in the pantheon of nature and science. It's also a quest to understand why we think as we do today about the natural world. Part 1. Departure. Emerging Ideas. 1. Beginnings. Alexander von Humboldt was born on September 14, 1769, into a wealthy aristocratic Prussian family who spent their winters in Berlin and their summers at the family estate of Tegel, a small castle about 10 miles northwest of the city. His father, Alexander Georg von Humboldt, was an officer in the army, a chamberlain at the Prussian court, and a confidant of the future King Friedrich Wilhelm II. Alexander's mother, Marie Elizabeth, was the daughter of a rich manufacturer who had brought money and land into the family. The Humboldt name was held in high regard in Berlin, and the future king was even Alexander's godfather. But despite their privileged upbringing, Alexander and his older brother Wilhelm had an unhappy childhood. Their beloved father died suddenly when Alexander was 9, and their mother never showed her sons much affection. Where their father had been charming and friendly, their mother was formal, cold, and emotionally distant. Instead of maternal warmth, she provided the best education then available in Prussia, arranging for the two boys to be privately tutored by a string of Enlightenment thinkers who instilled in them a love of truth, liberty, and knowledge. These were strange relationships, in which the boys sometimes searched for a father figure. One tutor in particular, Gottlob Johann Christian Kundt, who oversaw their education for many years, taught them with a peculiar combination of expressing displeasure and disappointment, while at the same time encouraging a sense of dependency. Hovering behind them and watching over their shoulders as they calculated, translated Latin texts, or learned French vocabulary, Kundt constantly corrected the brothers. He was never quite satisfied with their progress. Whenever they made a mistake, Kundt reacted as if they had done so to hurt or offend him. For the boys, this behavior was more painful than if he had spanked them with a cane. Always desperate to please Kundt, as Wilhelm later recounted, they had felt a perpetual anxiety to make him happy. It was particularly difficult for Alexander, who was taught the same lessons as his precocious brother, despite being 2 years younger. The result was that he believed himself to be less talented. When Wilhelm excelled in Latin and Greek, Alexander felt incompetent and slow. He struggled so much, Alexander later told a friend, that his tutors were doubtful whether even ordinary powers of intelligence would ever be developed in him. Wilhelm lost himself in Greek mythology and histories of ancient Rome, but Alexander felt restless with books. Instead, he escaped the classroom whenever he could to ramble through the countryside, collecting and sketching plants, animals, and rocks. When he returned, with his pockets full of insects and plants, his family nicknamed him the Little Apothecary, but they didn't take his interests seriously. According to family lore, one day the Prussian king, Frederick the Great, asked the boy if he planned to conquer the world like his namesake, Alexander the Great. Young Humboldt's answer was, "Yes, sir, but with my head." Much of his early life, Humboldt later told a close friend, was spent among people who loved him, but who didn't understand him. His teachers were demanding, and his mother lived withdrawn from society, and her sons. Marie Elizabeth von Humboldt's greatest concern was, Kundt said, to foster the intellectual and moral perfection of Wilhelm and Alexander. Their emotional well-being was seemingly of no interest. "I was forced into 1,000 constraints," Humboldt said, and into loneliness, hiding behind a wall of pretense because he never felt that he could be himself with his stern mother watching his every step. Expressions of excitement or of joy were unacceptable behavior in the Humboldt household. Alexander and Wilhelm were very different. Where Alexander was adventurous and enjoyed being outside, Wilhelm was serious and studious. Alexander was often torn between emotions, while Wilhelm's overriding character trait was self-control. Both brothers withdrew into their own worlds, Wilhelm into his books, and Alexander on lonely walks through Tegel's forests, great woods that had been planted with imported North American trees. As he wandered among colorful sugar maples and stately white oaks, Alexander experienced nature as calming and soothing. But it was also among these trees from another world that he began to dream of distant countries. Humboldt grew up a good-looking young man. He stood 5'8", but carried himself straight and proud, so that he seemed taller. He was slight and agile, quick on his feet and nimble. His hands were small and delicate, almost like those of a woman, as one friend commented. His eyes were inquisitive and always alert. His looks very much conformed to the ideals of the age: tousled hair, full expressive lips, and a dimpled chin. But he was often ill, suffering from fevers and neurasthenia, which Wilhelm believed was a kind of hypochondria, for the poor boy is unhappy. To hide his vulnerability, Alexander built a protective shield of wit and ambition. As a boy, he had been feared for his sharp comments, with one family friend calling him un petit esprit malin, a reputation he would live up to for the rest of his life. Even Alexander's closest friends admitted that he had a malicious streak. But Wilhelm said that his brother was never really spiteful, maybe a little vain, and driven by a deep urge to shine and excel. From his youth, Alexander seemed to have been torn between this vanity and his loneliness. between a craving for praise and his yearning for independence. Insecure, yet believing in his intellectual prowess, he seesawed between his need for approval and his sense of superiority. Born in the same year as Napoleon Bonaparte, Humboldt was raised in an increasingly global and accessible world. Fittingly, the months before his birth had seen the first international scientific collaboration, when astronomers from dozens of nations had coordinated and shared their observations of the transit of Venus. The problem of calculating longitude had finally been solved, and the empty areas of 18th-century maps were filling up fast. The world was changing. Just before Humboldt turned 7, American revolutionaries declared their independence, and shortly before his 20th birthday, the French followed suit with their own revolution in 1789. Germany was still under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as the French thinker Voltaire once said, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Not yet a nation, it was made up of many states, some tiny principalities, others ruled by large and powerful dynasties, such as the Hohenzollern in Prussia and the Habsburgs in Austria, which continued to fight for dominance and territories. In the mid-18th century, during the reign of Frederick the Great, Prussia had emerged as the greatest rival to Austria. By the time of Humboldt's birth, Prussia was known for its huge standing army and administrative efficiency. Frederick the Great had ruled as an absolute monarch, but nevertheless introduced some reforms, including a system of primary schooling and modest agrarian reform. First steps had also been taken towards religious tolerance in Prussia. Famed for his military prowess, Frederick the Great had been known for his love of music, philosophy, and learning, too. And though French and English contemporaries often dismissed the Germans as coarse and backward, there were more universities and libraries in the German states than anywhere else in Europe. As publishing and periodicals boomed, literacy rates soared. Meanwhile, Britain was marching ahead economically. Agricultural innovations such as crop rotation and new irrigation systems brought greater yields. The British were gripped by canal fever, lacing their island with a modern transport system. The Industrial Revolution had brought power looms and other machines, and manufacturing centers were mushrooming into cities. Husbandmen in Britain were turning from subsistence farming to feeding those living and working in the new urban centers. Man began to control nature with new technologies, such as James Watt's steam engines, and also with new medical advances, as the first people were inoculated against smallpox in Europe and North America. When Benjamin Franklin invented the lightning rod in the mid-18th century, humankind began to tame what had been regarded as expressions of God's fury. With such power, man lost his fear of nature. For the previous 2 centuries, Western society had been dominated by the idea that nature functioned like a complex apparatus, a great and complicated machine of the universe, as one scientist had said. After all, if man could create intricate clocks and automata, what great things could God create? According to the French philosopher René Descartes and his followers, God had given this mechanical world its initial push, while Isaac Newton regarded the universe more like a divine clockwork, with God as the maker, continuing to intervene. Inventions such as telescopes and microscopes revealed new worlds, and with them a belief that the laws of nature could be discovered. In Germany, the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz had in the late 17th century propounded ideas of a universal science based on mathematics. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, Newton had been uncovering the mechanics of the universe by applying mathematics to nature. As a result, the world began to be seen as reassuringly predictable, as long as humankind could comprehend those natural laws. Maths, objective observation, and controlled experiments paved this path of reason across the Western world. Scientists became citizens of their self-proclaimed Republic of Letters, an intellectual community that transcended national boundaries, religion, and language. As their letters zigzagged across Europe and the Atlantic, scientific discoveries and new ideas spread. This republic of letters was a country without borders, ruled by reason and not by monarchs. It was in this new age of enlightenment that Alexander von Humboldt was raised, with Western societies seemingly striding forward along a trajectory of confidence and improvement. With progress as the century's watchword, every generation envied the next. No one worried that nature itself might be destroyed. As young men, Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt joined Berlin's intellectual circles, where they discussed the importance of education, of tolerance, and of independent reasoning. As the brothers dashed from reading groups to philosophical salons in Berlin, learning, previously such a solitary occupation in Tegel, now became social. During the summers, their mother often stayed behind in Tegel, leaving the two young brothers with their tutors at the family's house in Berlin. But this freedom was not to last. Their mother made it clear that she expected them to become civil servants. Financially dependent on her, they had to accede to her wishes. Marie Elizabeth von Humboldt sent 18-year-old Alexander to university in Frankfurt an der Oder. Some 70 miles west of Berlin, this provincial institution had only 200 students, and she had probably chosen it for its closeness to Tegel rather than its academic merit. After Alexander had completed a semester of government administration studies and political economy there, it was decided that he was ready to join Wilhelm in Göttingen, one of the best universities in the German states. Wilhelm studied law, and Alexander focused on science, mathematics, and languages. Though the brothers were in the same town, they spent little time together. "Our characters are too different," Wilhelm said. While Wilhelm studied hard, Alexander dreamed of the tropics and adventures. He longed to leave Germany. As a boy, Alexander had read the journals of Captain James Cook and Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, both of whom had circumnavigated the globe, and imagined himself far away. When he saw the tropical palms at the Botanical Garden in Berlin, all he wanted to do was see them in their natural environments. This youthful wanderlust became more serious when Humboldt joined an older friend, Georg Forster, on a 4-month trip across Europe. Forster was a German naturalist who had accompanied Cook on his second voyage around the world. Humboldt and Forster had met in Göttingen. They often talked about the expedition, and Forster's lively descriptions of the South Pacific Islands made Humboldt's longing to travel even stronger. In the spring of 1790, Forster and Humboldt went to England, the Netherlands, and France, but the highlight of their journey was London, where everything made Humboldt think of distant countries. He saw the Thames choked with vessels bringing goods from all corners of the globe. Some 15,000 ships entered the port every year, loaded with spices from the East Indies, sugar from the West Indies, tea from China, wine from France, and timber from Russia. The whole river was a black forest of masts. In between the large trading ships were hundreds of barges, wherries, and smaller boats. Undoubtedly crowded and congested, it was also a magnificent portrait of Britain's imperial might. In London, Humboldt was introduced to botanists, explorers, artists, and thinkers. He met Captain William Bligh, of the infamous Mutiny on the Bounty, and Joseph Banks, Cook's botanist on his first voyage around the world, and by now the president of the Royal Society, the most important scientific forum in Britain. Humboldt admired the beguiling paintings and sketches that William Hodges, the artist who had joined Cook's second voyage, had brought back. Wherever Humboldt turned, new worlds were conjured up. Even in the early mornings, the first things he saw when he opened his eyes were the framed engravings of the East India Company ships that decorated the bedroom walls in his lodgings. Humboldt often wept when he saw these painful reminders of his unfulfilled dreams. "There is a drive in me," he wrote, "that often makes me feel as if I'm losing my mind." When the sadness became unbearable, he went on long, solitary walks. On one such excursion through the countryside in Hampstead, just north of London, He saw a recruiting notice nailed to a tree, calling for young sailors. For a brief moment he thought he had found an answer to his wishes, but then he remembered his strict mother. Humboldt felt an inexplicable pull towards the unknown, what the Germans call Fernweh, a longing for distant places, but he was too good a son, he conceded, to turn against her. He was slowly going crazy, he believed, and began to write mad letters to his friends back home. "My unhappy circumstances," Humboldt wrote to one friend on the eve of his departure from England, "force me to want what I can't have and to do what I don't like." But he still didn't dare to challenge his mother's expectations of what an upbringing in the Prussian elite entailed. Back home, Humboldt's misery became a frantic energy. He was impelled by a perpetual drive, he wrote, as if chased by 10,000 pigs. He darted back and forth, jumping from one subject to another. No longer did he feel insecure about his intellectual abilities or think himself lagging behind his older brother. He was proving to himself, his friends and family, just how clever he was. Forster was convinced that Humboldt's brain had been sadly overworked, and he was not the only one. Even Wilhelm von Humboldt's fiancée, Carolina von Dachroden, who had only met Alexander recently, was concerned. She liked Alexander, but she feared that he was going to snap. Many who knew him often remarked on his restless activity and how fast he spoke, at racehorse speed. Then, in the late summer of 1790, Humboldt began to study finance and economics at the Academy of Trade in Hamburg. He hated it, for it was all numbers and account books. In his spare time, Humboldt delved into scientific treatises and travel books. He learned Danish and Swedish. Anything was better than his business studies. Whenever he could, he walked down to the River Elbe in Hamburg, where he watched the large merchant vessels that brought tobacco, rice, and indigo from the United States. The sight of the ships in the harbor, he told a friend, was what held him together, a symbol of his hopes and dreams. He couldn't wait to be finally the master of his own luck. By the time he finished his studies in Hamburg, Humboldt was 21. Once again accommodating his mother's wishes, he enrolled in June 1791 at the prestigious mining academy in Freiburg, a small town near Dresden. It was a compromise that would prepare him for a career in the Prussian Ministry of Mines to appease his mother, but at least allowed him to indulge his interest in science and geology. The academy was the first of its kind, teaching the latest geological theories in the context of their practical application for mining. It was also home to a thriving scientific community, having attracted some of the best students and professors from across Europe. Within 8 months, Humboldt had completed a study program that took others 3 years. Every morning he rose before sunrise and drove to one of the mines around Freiburg. He spent the next 5 hours deep in the shafts, investigating the construction of the mines, the working methods, and the rocks. It helped that he was so lithe and wiry, moving easily through the narrow tunnels and low caves as he drilled and chiseled to take samples back home. He worked so ferociously that he often didn't notice the cold or damp. By noon, he crawled out of the darkness, dusted himself clean, and rushed back to the academy for seminars and lectures on minerals and geology. In the evenings, and often until deep into the night, Humboldt sat at his desk, hunched over his books by candlelight, reading and studying. During his free time, he investigated the influence of light, or its lack, on plants, and collected thousands of botanical specimens. He measured, noted, and classified. He was a child of the Enlightenment. Only a few weeks after he had arrived in Freiburg, he had to ride to Erfurt, some 100 miles to the west, to attend his brother's wedding to Carolina. But as so often, Humboldt combined social events or family celebrations with work. Instead of simply joining the festivities in Erfurt, he turned it into a 600-mile geological expedition through the region of Thuringia. Carolina was half amused and half concerned about her frenzied new brother-in-law. She enjoyed his energy, but also sometimes made fun of him, as a sister might tease a younger brother. Alexander had his quirks, and those should be respected, she told Wilhelm, but she was also worried about his state of mind and loneliness. In Freiburg, Humboldt's only real friend was a fellow student, the son of the family from whom he had rented a room. The two young men spent day and night together, studying and talking. "I have never loved someone so deeply," Humboldt admitted, but also berated himself for forming such an intense bond, because he knew he would have to leave Freiburg after his studies, and then feel even more lonely. The hard work at the academy, though, paid off when Humboldt finished his studies and was made a mining inspector at the astonishingly young age of 22, overtaking many more senior men. Half embarrassed by his stratospheric ascent, he was also vain enough to show off to friends and family in long letters. Most importantly, the position allowed him to travel thousands of miles in order to evaluate soils, shafts, and ore, from coal in Brandenburg and iron in Silesia to gold in the Fichtel Mountains and salt mines in Poland. During these travels, Humboldt met many people, but rarely opened his heart. He was content enough, he wrote to friends, but certainly not happy. Late at night, after a full day in the mines, or rattling along bad roads in his carriage, he thought of the few friends he had made over the past years. He felt damned, always lonely. As he ate another meal on his own in a squalid tavern or inn somewhere along his route, he was often too tired to write or talk. Some nights, though, he was so lonely that the need to communicate conquered his fatigue. Then he picked up his pen and composed long letters that looped and jumped, from detailed treatises about his work and scientific observations to emotional outbursts and declarations of love and friendship. He would give 2 years of his life for the memories of the time they had been together, he wrote to his friend in Freiburg, and confessed to have spent the sweetest hours of his life with him. Written late at night, some of these letters were raw with emotion and shaped by a desperate loneliness. In page after page, Humboldt poured out his heart and then excused his foolish letters. The next day, when work demanded his attention, all was forgotten, and it would often be weeks or even months until he wrote again. Even to the few who knew him best, Humboldt often remained elusive. Meanwhile, his career soared and his interests widened. Humboldt now also became interested in the working conditions of the miners whom he saw crawling into the bowels of the earth every morning. To improve their safety, he invented a breathing mask, as well as a lamp that would work even in the deepest oxygen-poor shafts. Shocked by the miners' lack of knowledge, Humboldt wrote textbooks for them and founded a mining school. When he realized that historical documents might prove useful for the exploitation of disused or inefficient mines because they sometimes mentioned rich veins of ores or recorded old findings, he spent weeks deciphering 16th-century manuscripts. He was working and traveling at such a manic pace that some of his colleagues thought he must have 8 legs and 4 arms. The intensity of it all made him ill, as he was still battling with recurring fevers and nervous disorders. The reasons, he thought, were probably a combination of being overworked and spending too much time in freezing conditions deep in the mines. But despite illness and his packed work schedule, Humboldt still managed to publish his first books, a specialized treatise on the basalts to be found along the River Rhine, and another on the subterranean flora in Freiburg, strange mold and sponge-like plants that grew in intricate shapes on the damp beams in the mines. He focused on what he could measure and observe. During the 18th century, natural philosophy, what we would call natural sciences today, evolved from being a subject within philosophy, along with metaphysics, logic, and moral philosophy, to becoming an independent discipline that required its own approach and methodology. In tandem, New natural philosophy subjects developed and emerged into distinctly separate disciplines, such as botany, zoology, geology, and chemistry. And though Humboldt was working across different disciplines at the same time, he still kept them separate. This growing specialization provided a tunnel vision that focused in on ever greater detail, but ignored the global view that would later become Humboldt's hallmark. It was during this period that Humboldt became obsessed with so-called animal electricity, or galvanism as it was known, after Luigi Galvani, an Italian scientist. Galvani had managed to make animal muscles and nerves convulse when he attached different metals to them. Galvani suspected that animal nerves contained electricity. Fascinated by the idea, Humboldt began a long series of 4,000 experiments in which he cut, prodded, poked, and electrocuted frogs, lizards, and mice. Not content with experimenting on animals alone, he began to use his own body, too, always taking his instruments on his work travels through Prussia. In the evenings, when his official work was done, he set up his electrical apparatus in the small bedrooms he rented. Metal rods, forceps, glass plates, and vials filled with all kinds of chemicals were lined up on the table, as was paper and pen. With a scalpel, he made incisions on his arms and torso. Then he carefully rubbed chemicals and acids into the open wounds, or stuck metals, wires, and electrodes onto his skin, or under his tongue. Every twitch, every convulsion, burning sensation, or pain was noted meticulously. Many of his wounds became infected, and some days his skin was striped with blood-filled welts. His body looked as battered as a street urchin, he admitted, but he also proudly reported that, despite the great pain, it all went splendidly. Through his experiments, Humboldt was engaging with one of the most hotly debated ideas in the scientific world, the concept of organic and inorganic matter, and whether either contained any kind of force or active principle. Newton had propounded the idea that matter was essentially inert, but that other properties were added by God. Meanwhile, those scientists who had been busy classifying flora and fauna had been more concerned with bringing order to chaos than with ideas that plants or animals might be governed by a different set of laws than inanimate objects. In the late 18th century, some scientists began to question this mechanical model of nature, noting its failure to explain the existence of living matter. And by the time Humboldt began to experiment with animal electricity, more and more scientists believed that matter was not lifeless, but that there had to be a force that triggered this activity. All over Europe, scientists began to discard Descartes' ideas that animals were essentially machines. Physicians in France, as well as the Scottish surgeon John Hunter, and in particular Humboldt's former professor in Göttingen, the scientist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, all began to formulate new theories of life. When Humboldt was studying in Göttingen, Blumenbach had published a revised edition of his book Über den Bildenstrieb. In it, Blumenbach presented a concept that explained that several forces existed within living organisms, such as plants and animals. The most important was what he called the Bildenstrieb, the formative drive, a force that shaped the formation of bodies. Every living organism, from humans to mold, had this formative drive, Blumenbach wrote, and it was essential for the creation of life. For Humboldt, nothing less was at stake in his experiments than the undoing of what he called the Gordian knot of the process. 2. Imagination and Nature. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Humboldt. In 1794, Alexander von Humboldt briefly interrupted his experiments and his mining inspection tours to visit his brother Wilhelm, who now lived with his wife Carolina and their 2 young children in Jena, some 150 miles southwest of Berlin. Jena was a town of only 4,000 people that lay within the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar, a small state that was headed by an enlightened ruler, Karl August. It was a center of learning and literature, that within a few years was to become the birthplace of German idealism and romanticism. The University of Jena had become one of the largest and most famous in the German-speaking regions, attracting progressive thinkers from across the other more repressive German states because of its liberal attitude. There was no other place, said the resident poet and playwright Friedrich Schiller, where liberty and truth ruled so much. 15 miles from Jena was Weimar, the state's capital, and the home of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Germany's greatest poet. Weimar had fewer than 1,000 houses and was said to be so small that everybody knew everybody. Cattle were driven through the cobbled streets, and the post was delivered so irregularly that it was easier for Goethe to send a letter to his friend Schiller, who worked at the university in Jena, with his greengrocer on her delivery rounds, rather than wait for the mail coach. In Jena and Weimar, one visitor said, the brightest minds came together, like the sun rays in a magnifying glass. Wilhelm and Carolina had moved to Jena in spring 1794 and were part of the circle of friends around Goethe and Schiller. They lived on the market square opposite Schiller, so close that they could wave out of the window to arrange their daily meetings. When Alexander arrived, Wilhelm dispatched a quick note to Weimar, inviting Goethe to Jena. Goethe was happy to come, and stayed, as always, in his guest rooms at the Duke's castle, not far away from the market square, just a couple of blocks north. During Humboldt's visit, the men met every day. They made a lively group. There were noisy discussions and roaring laughter, frequently until late at night. Despite his youth, Humboldt often took the lead. He forced us into the natural sciences, Goethe enthused, as they talked about zoology and volcanoes, as well as about botany, chemistry, and galvanism. In 8 days of reading books, one couldn't learn as much as what he gives you in an hour, Goethe said. December 1794 was bitterly cold. The frozen Rhine became a thoroughfare for Napoleon's troops on their warpath through Europe. Deep snow blanketed the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar. But every morning just before sunrise, Humboldt, Goethe, and a few other scientific friends trudged through the darkness and snow across Jena's market square. Wrapped up in thick woolen coats, they passed the sturdy 14th-century town hall on their walk to the university, where they attended lectures on anatomy. It was freezing in the almost empty auditorium in the medieval round stone tower that was part of the ancient city wall, but the advantage of the unusually low temperatures was that the cadavers they dissected there remained fresh for much longer. Goethe, who hated the cold and normally would have preferred the crackling heat of his stove, could not have been happier. He couldn't stop talking. Humboldt's presence stimulated him. Then in his mid-40s, Goethe was Germany's most celebrated literary figure. Exactly 2 decades previously, he had been catapulted to international fame with The Sorrows of Young Werther, a novel about a forlorn lover who commits suicide, which had encapsulated the sentimentality of that time. It became the book of a whole generation, and many identified with the eponymous protagonist. The novel was published in most European languages and became so popular that countless men, including young Karl August, the Duke of Saxe-Weimar, had dressed in a Werther uniform, consisting of a yellow waistcoat and breeches, blue tailcoat, brown boots, and round felt hat. People talked of Werther fever, and the Chinese even produced Werther porcelain, aimed at a European market. When Goethe first met Humboldt, he was no longer the dazzling young poet of the Sturm und Drang, the era of storm and stress. This German pre-Romantic period had celebrated individuality and a full spectrum of extreme feelings, from dramatic love to deep melancholy, all filled with passion, emotions, romantic poems, and novels. In 1775, when Goethe had first been invited to Weimar by the then 18-year-old Karl August, he had embarked on a long round of love affairs, drunkenness, and pranks. Goethe and Karl August had roistered through the streets of Weimar, sometimes wrapped in white sheets to scare those who believed in ghosts. They had stolen barrels from a local merchant to roll down hills and flirted with peasant girls, all in the name of genius and freedom. And, of course, no one could complain, since Karl August, the young ruler, was involved. But those wild years were long gone, and with them the theatrical declamations of love, the tears, the smashing of glasses, and naked swimming that had scandalized the locals. In 1788, 6 years before Humboldt's first visit, Goethe had shocked Weimar society one more time when he had taken the uneducated Christiane Vulpius as his lover. Christiane, who worked as a seamstress in Weimar, gave birth to their son August less than 2 years later. Ignoring convention and malicious gossip, Christiane and August lived with Goethe. By the time Goethe met Humboldt, he had calmed down and grown corpulent, with a double chin and a stomach cruelly described by one acquaintance as that of a woman in the last stages of pregnancy. His looks had gone, his beautiful eyes had disappeared into the fat of his cheeks, and many remarked that he was no longer a dashing Apollo. Goethe was still the confidant of and adviser to the Duke of Saxe-Weimar, who had ennobled him. Thus the von in Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's name. He was the director of the court theatre and held several well-paid administrative positions, which included the control of the duchy's mines and manufacturing. Like Humboldt, Goethe adored geology and mining, so much so that on special occasions he dressed his young son in a miner's uniform. Goethe had become the Zeus of Germany's intellectual circles, towering above all other poets and writers, but he could also be a cold, monosyllabled god. Some described him as melancholic, others as arrogant, proud, and bitter. Goethe had never been a great listener if the topic was not to his liking, and could end a discussion with a blatant display of his lack of interest or by abruptly changing the subject. He was sometimes so rude, particularly to young poets and thinkers, that they regularly ran out of the room. None of this mattered to his admirers. The sacred poetic fire, as one British visitor to Weimar said, had only burned to perfection in Homer, Cervantes, Shakespeare, and now it did so in Goethe. But Goethe wasn't happy. No one was more isolated than I was then. He was more fascinated by nature, the great mother, than by people. His large house in Weimar's town center reflected his tastes and status. It was elegantly furnished, filled with art and Italian statues, but also with vast collections of rocks, fossils, and dried plants. At the back of the house was a suite of plainer rooms that Goethe used as his study and library, overlooking a garden that he had designed for scientific study. In one corner of the garden was the small building that housed his huge geological collection. His favorite place, though, was his garden house near the River Ilm, outside the old city walls on the Duke's estate. Just a 10-minute walk from his main residence, this small, cozy house had been his first home in Weimar, but now it was his refuge, where he withdrew from the continuous stream of visitors. Here he wrote, gardened, or welcomed his most intimate friends. Vines and sweet-scented honeysuckle climbed along the walls and windows. There were vegetable plots, a meadow with fruit trees, and a long path lined with Goethe's beloved hollyhocks. When Goethe had first moved there in 1776, he had not only planted his own garden, but had also convinced the Duke to transform the castle's formal Baroque garden into a fashionable English landscape park, where irregularly planted groves of trees gave a natural feel. Goethe was getting tired of the world. The reign of terror in France had turned the initial idealism of the 1789 revolution into a bloody reality of mass executions of tens of thousands of so-called enemies of the revolution. This brutality, along with the ensuing violence that the Napoleonic Wars spread across Europe, had disillusioned Goethe, putting him in the most melancholic mood. As armies marched through Europe, he worried about the threats that faced Germany. He lived like a hermit, he said, and the only thing that kept him going was his scientific studies. Science, for him, was like a plank in a shipwreck. Today, Goethe is famed for his literary works, but he was a passionate scientist too, fascinated by the formation of the earth as well as botany. He had a rock collection that eventually numbered 18,000 specimens. As Europe descended into war, he quietly worked on comparative anatomy and optics. In the year of Humboldt's first visit, he established a botanical garden at the University of Jena. He wrote an essay, The Metamorphosis of Plants, in which he argued that there was an archetypal or primordial form underlying the world of plants. The idea was that each plant was the variation of such an urform. Behind variety was unity. According to Goethe, the leaf was this urform, the basic shape from which all others had developed, the petals, the calyx, and so on. Forwards and backwards, the plant is always nothing but leaf, he said. These were exciting ideas, but Goethe had no scientific sparring partner with whom to develop his theories. All that changed when he met Humboldt. It was as if Humboldt ignited the spark that had been missing for so long. When Goethe was with Humboldt, his mind worked in all directions. He pulled out old notebooks, books, and drawings. Papers piled up on the table as they discussed botanical and zoological theories. They scribbled, sketched, and read. Goethe was not interested in classification, but in the forces that shaped animals and plants, he explained. He distinguished between the internal force, the urform, that provided the general form of a living organism, and the environment, the external force, that shaped the organism itself. A seal, for example, had a body adapted to its sea habitat, the external force, Goethe said, but at the same time its skeleton displayed the same general pattern, the internal force, as those of land mammals. Like the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and later Charles Darwin, Goethe recognized that animals and plants adapted to their environment. The urform, he wrote, could be found in all living organisms in different stages of metamorphosis, even between animals and humans. Listening to Goethe talk with such breathless enthusiasm about his scientific ideas, Humboldt advised him to publish his theories on comparative anatomy. And so Goethe began to work at a frenzied pace, spending the early morning hours dictating to an assistant in his bedroom. Still in bed, propped up on pillows and wrapped in blankets to keep out the cold, Goethe worked more intensely than he had for years. There wasn't much time because by 10 a.m. Humboldt arrived, and their discussions continued. It was during this period that Goethe began to fling both his arms around whenever he went for a walk, provoking alarmed glances from his neighbors. He had discovered, he finally explained to a friend, that this exaggerated swinging of one's arms was a remnant from the four-legged animal, and therefore one of the proofs that animals and humans had a common ancestor. "That's how I walk more naturally," he said, and couldn't have cared less if Weimar society regarded this rather strange behavior as unrefined. Over the next few years, Humboldt regularly traveled to Jena and Weimar whenever he found time. Humboldt and Goethe went on long walks and dined together. They conducted experiments and inspected the new botanical garden in Jena. An invigorated Goethe moved easily from one topic to another. Early morning, corrected poem, then anatomy of frogs, was a typical entry in his diary during one of Humboldt's visits. Humboldt made him dizzy with ideas, Goethe told a friend. He had never met anyone so versatile. Humboldt's drive, Goethe said, whipped the scientific things with such speed that it was sometimes hard to follow. 3 years after his first visit, Humboldt arrived in Jena for a 3-month break. Once again, Goethe joined him there. Instead of going back and forth to Weimar, Goethe moved to his rooms at the old castle in Jena for a few weeks. Humboldt wanted to conduct a long series of experiments on animal electricity because he was trying to finish his book on the subject. Almost every day, often with Goethe, Humboldt walked the short distance from his brother's house to the university. He spent 6 or 7 hours in the anatomy theater, as well as lecturing on the subject. When a violent thunderstorm hit the area one warm spring day, Humboldt dashed outside to set up his instruments in order to measure the electricity in the atmosphere. As the rain lashed down and thunder reverberated across the fields, the small town was illuminated by a wild dance of lightning. Humboldt was in his element. The next day, when he heard that a farmer and his wife had been killed by the lightning, he rushed over to obtain their corpses. Laying out their bodies on the table in the round anatomy tower, he analyzed everything. The man's leg bones looked as if they had been pierced by shotgun pellets, Humboldt noted excitedly, but the worst damage was to the genitals. At first, he thought the pubic hair might have been ignited and caused the burns, but dismissed the idea when he saw the couple's unharmed armpits. Despite the increasingly putrid smell of death and burned flesh, Humboldt enjoyed every minute of this gruesome investigation. "I cannot exist without experiments," he said. Humboldt's favorite experiment was one that he and Goethe discovered together by chance. One morning, Humboldt placed a frog's leg on a glass plate and connected its nerves and muscles to different metals in sequence, to silver, gold, iron, zinc, and so on, but generated only a discouraging, gentle twitch in the leg. When he then leaned over the leg in order to check the connecting metals, it convulsed so violently that it leapt off the table. Both men were stunned, until Humboldt realized that it had been the moisture of his breath that had triggered the reaction. As the tiny droplets in his breath had touched the metals, they had created an electric current that had moved the frog's leg. It was the most magical experiment he had ever carried out, Humboldt decided, because by exhaling onto the frog's leg, it was as if he were breathing life into it. It was the perfect metaphor for the emergence of the new life sciences. In this context, they also discussed the theories of Humboldt's former professor, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, about the forces that shaped organisms, the so-called formative drive and vital forces. Fascinated, Goethe then applied these ideas to his own about the Urform. The formative drive, Goethe wrote, triggered the development of certain parts in the Urform. The snake, for example, has an endlessly long neck because neither matter nor force had been wasted on arms or legs. By contrast, the lizard has a shorter neck because it also has legs, while the frog has an even shorter neck because its legs are longer. Goethe then went on to explain his belief that, contrary to Descartes' theory that animals were machines, a living organism consisted of parts that only function as a unified whole. To put it simply, a machine could be dismantled and then assembled again, while the parts of a living organism worked only in relation to each other. In a mechanical system, the parts shaped the whole, while in an organic system, the whole shaped the parts. Humboldt widened this concept, and although his own theories of animal electricity were eventually proved wrong, they did give him the foundation of what would become his new understanding of nature. Whereas Blumenbach and other scientists applied the idea of forces to organisms, Humboldt applied them to nature on a much broader level, interpreting the natural world as a unified whole that is animated by interactive forces. This new way of thinking changed his approach. If everything was connected, then it was important to examine the differences and similarities without ever losing sight of the whole. Comparison became Humboldt's primary means of understanding nature, not abstract mathematics or numbers. Goethe was captivated, reporting to his friends how much he admired the young man's intellectual virtuosity. It was telling that Humboldt's presence in Jena coincided with one of Goethe's most productive phases in years. Not only did he join Humboldt in the anatomy tower, but Goethe was also composing his epic poem Hermann and Dorothea and returning to his theories on optics and color. He examined insects, dissected worms and snails, and continued his studies in geology. His days and nights were now occupied with work. Our little academy, as Goethe called it, was very busy. Wilhelm von Humboldt was working on a verse translation of one of Aeschylus's Greek tragedies, which he discussed with Goethe. With Alexander, Goethe set up an optical apparatus to analyze light and investigated the luminescence of phosphor. In the afternoons or evenings, they sometimes met at Wilhelm's and Carolina's house, but more often assembled at Friedrich Schiller's house on the market square, where Goethe recited his poems and others presented their own work until late at night. Goethe was so exhausted that he admitted to almost looking forward to a few peaceful days in Weimar to recover. Alexander von Humboldt's pursuit of knowledge was so infectious, Goethe told Schiller, that his own scientific interests had been woken from hibernation. Schiller, though, worried that Goethe was being pulled too far away from poetry and aesthetics. All this was Humboldt's fault, Schiller believed. Schiller also thought that Humboldt would never accomplish anything great because he dabbled in too many subjects. Humboldt was only interested in measurements, and despite the richness of his knowledge, his work displayed a poverty of meaning. Schiller remained a lone negative voice. Even the friend he confided in disagreed. Yes, Humboldt was enthusiastic about measurements, but these were the building blocks for his wider understanding of nature. After a month in Jena, Goethe returned to Weimar, but quickly missed his newfound stimulation and immediately invited Humboldt to visit. 5 days later, Humboldt arrived in Weimar and stayed for a week. The first evening, Goethe kept his guest to himself, but on the next day they had lunch at the castle with Karl August, followed by a big dinner party at Goethe's house. Goethe showed off what Weimar had to offer. He took Humboldt to see the landscape paintings in the Duke's collections, as well as some geological specimens that had just arrived from Russia. Almost every day they went for meals at the castle, where Karl August invited Humboldt to conduct some experiments to entertain his guests. Humboldt had to oblige, but he thought the time spent at court was utterly wasted. For the next month, until Humboldt's final departure from Jena, Goethe commuted between his house in Weimar and his rooms in the castle in Jena. They read natural history books together and went out for long walks. In the evening they shared meals and reviewed the latest philosophical texts. They now often met at Schiller's newly bought garden house, just outside the city walls. Schiller's garden was bordered by a little river at the back, where the men sat in a small arbor. A round stone table in the middle was laden with glasses and plates of food, but also with books and papers. The weather was glorious, and they enjoyed the mild early summer evenings. At night, they could only hear the gurgling of the stream and the song of the nightingale. They talked about art, nature, and the mind, as Goethe wrote in his diary. The ideas they discussed were engaging scientists and thinkers across Europe, the question of how to understand nature. Broadly speaking, two schools of thought vied for dominance: rationalism and empiricism. Rationalists tended to believe that all knowledge came from reason and rational thought, while the empiricists argued that one could know the world only through experience. Empiricists insisted that there was nothing in the mind that had not come from the senses. Some went so far as to say that at birth the human mind was like a blank piece of paper without any preconceived ideas, and that over a lifetime it filled up with knowledge that came from sensory experience alone. For the sciences, this meant that the empiricists always had to test their theories against observations and with experiments, while the rationalists could base a thesis on logic and reason. A few years before Humboldt first met Goethe, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant had declared a philosophical revolution that he had boldly claimed was as radical as that of Copernicus some 250 years previously. Kant took up a position between rationalism and empiricism. The laws of nature, as we understand them, Kant wrote in his famous Critique of Pure Reason, only existed because our mind interpreted them. Just as Copernicus had concluded that the sun couldn't be moving around us, so, Kant said, we had to completely change our understanding of how we made sense of nature. The dualism between the external and the internal world had preoccupied philosophers for millennia. It was a question that asks, is the tree that I'm seeing in my garden the idea of that tree or the real tree? For a scientist such as Humboldt, who is trying to understand nature, this was the most important question. Humans were like citizens of two worlds, occupying both the world of the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, which was the external world, and the internal world of one's perception, how things appeared to individuals. According to Kant, the thing in itself could never be truly known, while the internal world was always subjective. What Kant brought to the table was the so-called transcendental level, the concept that when we experience an object, it becomes a thing as it appears to us. Our senses, as much as our reason, are like tinted spectacles through which we perceive the world. Though we may believe that the way we order and understand nature is based on pure reason, upon classification, the laws of motion, and so on, Kant believed that this order was shaped by our mind, through those tinted spectacles. We impose this order on nature, and not nature upon us. And with this, the self became the creative ego, almost like a lawgiver of nature, even if it meant that we could never have a true knowledge of the thing in itself. The result was that the emphasis was shifting towards the self. There was more that interested Humboldt. One of Kant's most popular lecture series at the University in Königsberg, today's Kaliningrad in Russia, but then part of Prussia, was on geography. Over 40 years, Kant taught this lecture series 48 times. In his Physische Geographie, as the series was called, Kant insisted that knowledge was a systematic construct in which individual facts needed to fit into a larger framework in order to make sense. He used the image of a house to explain this. Before constructing it, brick by brick and piece by piece, it was necessary to have an idea of how the entire building would look. It was this concept of a system that became the linchpin of Humboldt's later thinking. There was no avoiding these ideas in Jena. Everybody was talking about them, with one British visitor remarking that the small town was the most fashionable seat of the new philosophy. Goethe admired Kant, and had read all his works, and Wilhelm was so fascinated that Alexander worried his brother would study himself to death over the critique of pure reason. One of Kant's pupils, who was teaching at Jena University, told Schiller that within the next century, Kant would be as famous as Jesus Christ. What interested those in the Jena circle most was this relationship between the internal and the external world. Ultimately, it led to the question, how is knowledge possible? During the Enlightenment, the internal and the external world had been regarded as two entirely separate entities, but later, English romantics, such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and American transcendentalists, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, would declare that man had once been one with nature, during a long-vanished golden age. It was this lost unity that they strove to restore, insisting that the only way to do so was through art, poetry, and emotions. According to the Romantics, nature could only be understood by turning inwards. Humboldt was immersed in Kant's theories, and would later keep a bust of the philosopher in his study, calling him a great philosopher. Half a century later, he would still say that the external world only existed insofar as we perceived it within ourselves. As it was shaped inside the mind, so did it shape our understanding of nature. The external world, ideas and feelings, melt into each other, Humboldt would write. Goethe was also grappling with these ideas of the self and nature, of the subjective and the objective, of science and imagination. He had developed, for example, a color theory in which he discussed how color was perceived, a concept in which the role of the eye had become central because it brought the outer world into the inner. Goethe insisted that objective truth could only be attained by combining subjective experiences through the perception of the eye, for example, with the observer's power of reasoning. The senses do not deceive, Goethe declared. It is judgment that deceives. This growing emphasis on subjectivity began radically to change Humboldt's thinking. It was the time in Jena that moved him from purely empirical research towards his own interpretation of nature, a concept that brought together exact scientific data with an emotional response to what he was seeing. Humboldt had long believed in the importance of close observation and of rigorous measurements, firmly embracing Enlightenment methods, but now he also began to appreciate individual perception and subjectivity. Only a few years previously, he had admitted that vivid fantasy confuses me, but now he came to believe that imagination was as necessary as rational thought in order to understand the natural world. Nature must be experienced through feeling, Humboldt wrote to Goethe, insisting that those who wanted to describe the world by simply classifying plants, animals, and rocks will never get close to it. It was also around this time that both read Erasmus Darwin's popular poem, Loves of the Plants. The grandfather of Charles Darwin, Erasmus was a physician, inventor, and scientist who, in his poem, had turned the Linnaean sexual classification system of plants into verses crowded with lovesick violets, jealous cowslips, and blushing roses. Populated by horned snails, fluttering leaves, silver moonlight, and love-making on moss-embroidered beds, Loves of the Plants had become the most talked-about poem in England. 4 decades later, Humboldt would write to Charles Darwin how much he had admired his grandfather for proving that a mutual admiration for nature and imagination was powerful and productive. Goethe was not quite as impressed. He liked the idea of the poem, but found its execution too pedantic and rambling, commenting to Schiller that the verses lacked any trace of poetic feeling. Goethe believed in the marriage of art and science, and his reawakened fascination with science did not, as Schiller had feared, remove him from his art. For too long, poetry and science had been regarded as the greatest antagonists, Goethe said. But now he began to infuse his literary work with science. In Faust, Goethe's most famous play, the drama's main protagonist, the restless scholar Heinrich Faust, makes a pact with the devil, Mephistopheles, in exchange for infinite knowledge. Published in 2 separate parts as Faust I and Faust II in 1808 and 1832, Goethe wrote Faust in bursts of activity that often coincided with Humboldt's visits. Faust, like Humboldt, was driven by a relentless striving for knowledge, by a feverish unrest, as he declares in the play's first scene. At the time when he was working on Faust, Goethe said about Humboldt, "I've never known anyone who combined such a deliberately channeled activity with such plurality of the mind," words that might have described Faust. Both Faust and Humboldt believed that ferocious activity and inquiry brought understanding, and both found strength in the natural world and believed in the unity of nature. Like Humboldt, Faust was trying to discover all nature's hidden powers. When Faust declares his ambition in the first scene, "that I may detect the inmost force which binds the world and guides its course," it could have been Humboldt speaking. That something of Humboldt was in Goethe's Faust, or something of Faust in Humboldt, was obvious to many, so much so that people commented on the resemblance when the play was finally published in 1808. There were other examples of Goethe's fusion of art and science. For his poem Metamorphosis of Plants, he translated his earlier essay about the Urform of plants into poetry. And for Elective Affinities, a novel about marriage and love, he chose a contemporary scientific term as a title that described the tendency of certain chemical elements to combine. Because of this inherent affinity of the chemicals actively to bond with another, this was also an important theory within the circle of scientists who discussed the vital force of matter. The French scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace, for example, whom Humboldt greatly admired, explained that all chemical combinations are the result of attractive forces. Laplace saw this as nothing less than the key to the universe. Goethe used the properties of these chemical bonds to evoke relationships and changing passions between the four protagonists in the novel. This was chemistry translated into literature. Nature, science, and imagination were moving ever closer. Or, as Faust says, knowledge could not be wrenched from nature by observation, instrument, or experiment alone. We snatch in vain at nature's veil. She is mysterious in broad daylight. No screws or levers can compel her to reveal the secrets she has hidden from our sight. Goethe's descriptions of nature in his plays, novels, and poems were as truthful, Humboldt believed, as the discoveries of the best scientists. He would never forget that Goethe encouraged him to combine nature and art, facts and imagination, and it was this new emphasis on subjectivity that allowed Humboldt to link the previous mechanistic view of nature, as promulgated by scientists such as Leibniz, Descartes, or Newton, with the poetry of the Romantics. Humboldt would thus become the link that connected Newton's optics, which explained that rainbows were created by light refracting through raindrops, to poets like John Keats, who declared that Newton had destroyed all the poetry of the rainbow by reducing it to a prism. The time in Jena, Humboldt later recalled, affected me powerfully. Being with Goethe, Humboldt said, equipped him with new organs through which to see and understand the natural world. And it was with those new organs that Humboldt would see. 3. In Search of a Destination. As Humboldt traveled across the vast Prussian territory, inspecting mines and meeting scientific friends, he continued to dream of faraway countries. That longing never disappeared, but he also knew that his mother, Marie Elizabeth von Humboldt, had never shown any patience with his adventurous dreams. She expected him to climb the ranks of the Prussian administration, and he felt chained to her wishes. All that changed when she died of cancer in November 1796, after battling the disease for more than a year. Perhaps unsurprisingly, neither Wilhelm nor Alexander grieved much for their mother. She had always found fault in whatever her sons did, Wilhelm confided to his wife, Carolina. No matter how successfully they had completed their studies or excelled in their careers, she had never been satisfied. During her illness, Wilhelm had dutifully moved from Jena to Tegel in Berlin to look after her, but he had missed the intellectual stimulation in Jena. Oppressed by his mother's dark presence, he couldn't read, work, or think. He felt paralyzed, Wilhelm had written to Schiller. When Alexander briefly visited, he had left as soon as possible, leaving his brother in charge. After 15 months, Wilhelm had not been able to bear the vigil any longer and returned to Jena. 2 weeks later, their mother died, with neither son at her bedside. The brothers did not attend her funeral. Other events seemed of greater importance. Alexander was more excited about the attention that his new miner's lamps were receiving, along with his experiments in galvanism. 4 weeks after his mother's death, Alexander was announcing his preparations for his great voyage. Having waited for years for the opportunity to control his own destiny, he finally felt unshackled at the age of 27. Her death didn't affect him much, he confessed to his old friend from Freiburg, because they had been strangers to each other. Over the previous few years, Humboldt had spent as little time as possible at the family home, and whenever he left Tegel, he had been relieved. As one close friend wrote to Humboldt, "Her death must be particularly welcomed by you." Within a month, Alexander had resigned as a mining inspector. Wilhelm waited a little longer, but moved a few months later to Dresden and then to Paris, where he and Carolina turned their new house into a salon for writers, artists, and poets. Their mother's death had left the brothers wealthy. Alexander had inherited almost 100,000 thalers. "I have so much money," he bragged, "that I can get my nose, mouth, and ears gilded." He was rich enough to afford to go anywhere he liked. He had always lived relatively simply because he was not interested in luxuries. Lavishly printed books, yes, or expensive new scientific instruments, but he had no interest in elegant clothing or fashionable furniture. An expedition, on the other hand, was something very different, and he was willing to spend a large part of his inheritance on it. He was so excited that he couldn't decide where to go, and mentioned so many possible destinations that no one knew what his plans were. He spoke of Lapland and Greece, then Hungary or Siberia, and maybe the West Indies or the Philippines. The precise destination didn't yet matter, because first he wanted to prepare, and now he did so with pedantic drive. He had to test and buy all the instruments he needed, as well as travel through Europe to learn everything he could about geology, botany, zoology, and astronomy. His early publications and growing network of contacts opened the doors, and he had even had a new plant species named after him, Humboldtia laurifolia, a splendid tree from India, he wrote to a friend. "Isn't that fabulous?" Over the next months, he interviewed geologists in Freiburg and learned how to use his sextant in Dresden. He climbed the Alps to investigate mountains, so that he might later compare them, as he told Goethe, and in Jena he conducted more electrical experiments. In Vienna he examined tropical plants in the hothouses of the Imperial Garden, where he also tried to convince the young director, Joseph van der Schoot, to accompany him on his expedition, declaring that their future together would be sweet. He spent a cold winter in Salzburg, Mozart's birthplace, where he measured the height of the nearby Austrian Alps and tested his meteorological instruments, braving icy rains as he held his instruments in the air during storms to detect the electricity of the atmosphere. He read and reread all the travelers' accounts he could get hold of, and pored over botanical books. As he rushed from one learned center in Europe to another, Humboldt's letters exuded a breathless energy. "This is just the way I am. I do what I do, impetuously and briskly," he said. There was no one place where he could learn everything, and no one person could teach him everything. After about a year of frantic preparations, it dawned upon Humboldt that, although his trunks were stuffed with equipment and his head was filled with the latest scientific knowledge, the political situation in Europe was making his dreams impossible. Much of Europe was embroiled in the French Revolutionary Wars. The execution of the French king, Louis XVI, in January 1793, had united the European nations against the French revolutionaries. In the years following the Revolution, France had declared war on one country after another, in a roll call that included, among others, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, and Britain. Gains and losses were made on both sides, treaties signed and then overthrown. But by 1798, Napoleon had gained Belgium, the Rhineland from Prussia, the Austrian Netherlands, and large parts of Italy for France. Wherever Humboldt turned, his movements were hampered by war and armies. Even Italy, with the tantalizing geological prospects of the volcanoes Mount Etna and Vesuvius, had, thanks to Napoleon, been closed off. Humboldt needed to find a nation that would let him join a voyage, or which would at least grant him passage to their colonial possessions. He begged the British and the French for help, and then the Danes. He considered a voyage to the West Indies, but found his hopes dashed by the ongoing sea battles. Then he accepted an invitation to accompany the British Earl of Bristol to Egypt, even though the old aristocrat was known for being rather eccentric. But again these plans came to nothing when Bristol was arrested by the French, suspected of espionage. At the end of April 1798, 1.5 years after his mother's death, Humboldt decided to visit Paris, where Wilhelm and Carolina now lived. He hadn't seen his brother for more than a year, and turning his attention to the victorious French also seemed the most practical solution to his travel dilemma. In Paris, he spent time with his brother and sister-in-law, but also wrote letters, contacted people, and cajoled. filling his notebooks with the addresses of countless scientists, as well as buying yet more books and instruments. "I live in the midst of science," Humboldt wrote excitedly. As he made his rounds, he met his boyhood hero, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, the explorer who had first set foot on Tahiti in 1768. At the grand old age of 70, Bougainville was planning a voyage across the globe to the South Pole. Impressed by the young Prussian scientist, he invited Humboldt to join him. It was also in Paris that Humboldt first ran into a young French scientist, Aimé Bonpland, in the hallway of the house where both were renting a room. With a battered botany box, a vasculum, slung across his shoulder, Bonpland was obviously also interested in plants. He had been taught by the best French naturalists in Paris, and, as Humboldt learned, was a talented botanist, skilled in comparative anatomy, and had also served as a surgeon in the French Navy. Born in La Rochelle, a port town on the Atlantic coast, the 25-year-old Bonpland was from a naval family with a love for adventures and voyages in his blood. Bumping into each other regularly in the corridors of their accommodation, Bonpland and Humboldt began to talk, and quickly discovered a mutual adoration for plants and foreign travels. Like Humboldt, Bonpland was keen to see the world. Humboldt decided that Bonpland would be the perfect companion. Not only was he passionate about botany and the tropics, but he was also good-natured and charming. Stoutly built, Bonpland exuded a solid strength that promised resilience, good health, and reliability. In many ways, he was Humboldt's exact opposite. Where Humboldt spread frantic activity, Bonpland carried an air of calmness and docility. They were to make a great team. In the midst of all the preparations, Humboldt now seemed to experience flashes of guilt about his late mother. There were rumors, Friedrich Schiller told Goethe, that Alexander couldn't get rid of the spirit of his mother. Apparently, she appeared to him all the time. A mutual acquaintance had told Schiller that Humboldt was participating in some dubious séances in Paris involving her. Humboldt had always been afflicted by a great fear of ghosts, as he had admitted to a friend a few years previously, but now it had got much worse. No matter how much he cast himself as a rational scientist, he felt his mother's spirit watching his every move. It was time to escape. The immediate problem, though, was that the command of Bougainville's expedition was given to a younger man, Captain Nicolas Baudin. Though Humboldt received assurances that he could join Baudin on his voyage, the whole expedition foundered due to a lack of government funds. Humboldt refused to give up. He now wondered if he could join the 200 scholars who accompanied Napoleon's army, which had left Toulon in May 1798 to invade Egypt. But how to get there? Few, Humboldt admitted, have had greater difficulties. As the quest for a ship continued, Humboldt contacted the Swedish consul in Paris, who promised to procure him a passage from Marseille to Algiers on the North African coast, from where he could travel overland to Egypt. Humboldt also asked his London acquaintance, Joseph Banks, to obtain a passport for Bonpland in case they encountered an English warship. He was prepared for all eventualities. Humboldt himself traveled with a passport issued by the Prussian ambassador in Paris. Along with his name and age, the document gave a rather detailed, though not exactly objective description, stating that he had gray eyes, a large mouth, a big nose, and a well-formed chin. Humboldt scribbled in the margins, in jest, "Large mouth, fat nose, but chin bien fait." At the end of October, Humboldt and Bonpland rushed to Marseille, ready to leave immediately. But nothing happened. For 2 months, day after day, they climbed the hill to the old church of Notre-Dame de la Garde to scan the harbor. Every time they saw the white glimmer of a sail on the horizon, their hopes rose. When news reached them that their promised frigate had been badly damaged in a storm, Humboldt decided to charter his own vessel, but quickly discovered that, regardless of all the money he had, the recent naval battles made it impossible to find a ship. Wherever he turned, all hopes were shattered, he wrote to an old friend in Berlin. He was exasperated. His pockets full of money and his mind brimming with the latest scientific knowledge, yet still not able to travel. War and politics, Humboldt said, stopped everything, and the world is closed. Finally, at the end of 1798, almost exactly 2 years after his mother's death, Humboldt gave up on the French and traveled to Madrid to try his luck there. The Spanish were famous for their reluctance to let foreigners enter their territories, but with charm and a string of useful connections at the Spanish court, Humboldt managed to obtain the unlikely permission. In early May 1799, King Carlos IV of Spain provided a passport to the colonies in South America and the Philippines on the express condition that Humboldt financed the voyage himself. In return, Humboldt promised to dispatch flora and fauna for the royal cabinet and garden. Never before had a foreigner been allowed such great freedom to explore their territories. Even the Spanish themselves were surprised by their king's decision. Humboldt had no intention of wasting any more time. 5 days after they received their passports, Humboldt and Bonpland left Madrid for La Coruña, a port at the northwestern tip of Spain, where the frigate Pizarro was waiting for them. In early June 1799, they were ready to sail, despite warnings that British warships had been sighted nearby. Nothing, neither cannons nor a fear of the enemy, could spoil the moment. "My head is dizzy with joy," Humboldt wrote. He had bought a great collection of the latest instruments, ranging from telescopes and microscopes to a large pendulum clock and compasses. 42 instruments in all, individually packed into protective velvet-lined boxes, along with vials for storing seeds and soil samples, reams of paper, scales, and countless tools. "My mood was good," Humboldt noted in his diary, "just as it should be when beginning a great work." In the letters written on the eve of their departure, he explained his intentions. Like previous explorers, he would collect plants, seeds, rocks, and animals. He would measure the height of mountains, determine longitude and latitude, and take temperatures of water and air. But the real purpose of the voyage, he said, was to discover how all forces of nature are interlaced and interwoven, how organic and inorganic nature interacted. "Man needs to strive for the good and the great," Humboldt wrote in his last letter from Spain. "The rest depends on destiny." As they sailed toward the tropics, Humboldt grew increasingly excited. They caught and examined fish, jellyfish, seaweed, and birds. He tested his instruments, took temperatures, and measured the height of the sun. One night the water seemed to be on fire with phosphorescence. The whole sea, Humboldt noted in his diary, was like an edible liquid, full of organic particles. After 2 weeks at sea, they briefly stopped at Tenerife, the largest of the Canary Islands. It was a rather unspectacular arrival at first, as the whole island was shrouded in fog, but when the thick mist lifted, Humboldt saw the sun illuminating the glistening white summit of the volcano Pico del Teide. He rushed to the bow of their ship, breathlessly catching a glimpse of the first mountain that he was going to climb, outside Europe. With their ship scheduled to spend only a couple of days in Tenerife, there was not much time. The next morning, Humboldt, Bonpland, and some local guides set off towards the volcano, without tents or coats, and armed only with some weak fir torches. It was hot in the valleys, but the temperature dropped rapidly as they ascended the volcano. When they reached the peak at more than 12,000 feet, the wind was so strong they could hardly stand. Their faces were frozen, but their feet were burning from the heat emanating from the hot ground. It was painful, but Humboldt couldn't care less. There was something in the air that created a magical transparency, he said, an enticing promise of what was to come. He could hardly tear himself away, but they had to get back to the ship. Back on the Pizarro, the anchors were lifted, and their journey continued. Humboldt was happy. His only complaint was that they were not allowed to light their lamps or candles at night for fear of attracting the enemy. For a man like Humboldt, who only needed a few hours' sleep, it was torture having to lie in the dark without anything to read, dissect, or investigate. The further south they sailed, the shorter the days became, and soon he was out of work by 6 o'clock in the evening. So he observed the night sky, and, as many other explorers and sailors who had crossed the equator, Humboldt marveled at the new stars that appeared, constellations that only graced the southern sky, and that were a nightly reminder of how far he had traveled. When he first saw the Southern Cross, Humboldt realized that he had achieved the dreams of his earliest youth. On July 16, 1799, 41 days after they had left La Coruña in Spain, the coast of New Andalusia, today part of Venezuela, appeared on the horizon. Their first view of the New World was a voluptuous green belt of palms and banana groves that ran along the shore, beyond which Humboldt could make out tall mountains, their distant peaks peeping through layers of clouds. A mile inland and hugged by cacao trees lay Cumana, a city founded by the Spanish in 1523 and almost destroyed by an earthquake in 1797, 2 years before Humboldt's arrival. This was to be their home for the next few months. The sky was of the clearest blue, and there was not a trace of mist in the air. The heat was intense, and the light dazzling. The moment that Humboldt stepped off the boat, he plunged his thermometer into the white sand. 37.7 degrees Celsius, he scribbled in his notebook. Cumana was the capital of New Andalusia, a province within the Captaincy General of Venezuela, which itself was part of the Spanish colonial empire that stretched from California all the way to the southern tip of Chile. All of Spain's colonies were controlled by the Spanish Crown and Council of the Indies in Madrid. It was a system of absolute rule, where the viceroys and captains general reported directly to Spain. The colonies were forbidden to trade with each other without explicit permission. Communication was also closely controlled. Licenses had to be granted to print books and newspapers, while local printing presses and manufacturing businesses were prohibited, and only those born in Spain were allowed to own shops or mines in the colonies. When revolutions had spread through the British North American colonies and France in the last quarter of the 18th century, the colonists in the Spanish Empire had been kept on a tight leash. They had to pay exorbitant taxes to Spain and were excluded from any government roles. All non-Spanish ships were treated as enemy, and no one, not even a Spaniard, was allowed to enter the colonies without a warrant from the king. The result was growing resentment. With relations between the colonies and the mother country so tense, Humboldt knew that he would have to tread carefully. Despite his passport from the Spanish king, local administrators would be able to make his life extremely difficult. If he did not succeed in inspiring some personal interest in those who govern the colonies, Humboldt was certain, he would face numberless inconveniences during his time in the New World. Yet, before presenting his paperwork to the governor of Cumana, Humboldt soaked up the tropical scenery. Everything was so new and spectacular. Each bird, palm, or wave announced the grand aspect of nature. It was the beginning of a new life, a period of 5 years in which Humboldt would change from a curious and talented young man into the most extraordinary scientist of his age. It was here that Humboldt would see nature with both head and heart. Part 2. Arrival. Collecting Ideas. 4. South America. Wherever Humboldt and Bonpland turned during those first weeks in Cumana, something new caught their attention. The landscape held a spell over him, Humboldt said. The palm trees were ornamented with magnificent red blossoms. The birds and fish seemed to compete in their kaleidoscopic hues, and even the crayfish were sky blue and yellow. Pink flamingos stood one-legged at the shore, and the palms' fanned leaves mottled the white sand into a patchwork of shade and sun. There were butterflies, monkeys, and so many plants to catalogue that, as Humboldt wrote to Wilhelm, we run around like fools. Even the usually unruffled Bonpland said that he would go mad if the wonders don't stop soon. Having always prided himself on his systematic approach, Humboldt found it difficult to come up with a rational method of studying his surroundings. Their trunks filled so quickly that they had to order more reams of paper on which to press their plants, and sometimes they found so many specimens that they could hardly carry them back to their house. Unlike other naturalists, Humboldt was not interested in filling taxonomic gaps. He was collecting ideas rather than just natural history objects, he said. It was the impression of the whole, Humboldt wrote, that captivated his mind more than anything. Humboldt compared everything he saw with what he had previously observed and learned in Europe. Whenever he picked up a plant, a rock, or an insect, his mind raced back to what he had seen at home. The trees that grew in the plains around Cumaná, with their branches forming parasol-like canopies, reminded him of Italian pines. When seen from a distance, the sea of cacti created the same effect as the grasses in the marshes in the northern climates. Here was a valley that made him think of Derbyshire in England, or caverns similar to those in Franconia in Germany, and those in the Carpathian Mountains in Eastern Europe. Everything seemed somehow connected, an idea that would come to shape his thinking about the natural world for the rest of his life. Humboldt had never been happier and healthier. The heat suited him, and the fevers and nervous afflictions from which he had suffered in Europe disappeared. He even put on some weight. During the day he and Bonpland collected, in the evening they sat together and wrote up their notes, and at night they took astronomical observations. One such night they stood awed for hours as a meteor shower drew thousands of white tails across the sky. Humboldt's letters home burst with excitement, and brought this wondrous world into the elegant salons of Paris, Berlin, and Rome. He wrote of huge spiders that ate hummingbirds, and of 30-foot snakes. Meanwhile, he amazed the people of Cumaná with his instruments. His telescopes brought the moon close to them, and his microscopes transformed the lice in their hair into monstrous beasts. There was one aspect that dampened Humboldt's joy: the slave market opposite their rented house in Cumaná's main square. Since the early 16th century, the Spanish had imported slaves to their colonies in South America and continued to do so. Every morning, young African men and women were put on sale. They were forced to rub themselves with coconut oil to make their skin shiny black. They were then paraded for prospective buyers, who jerked open the slaves' mouths to examine their teeth like horses in a market. The sight made Humboldt a lifelong abolitionist. Then, on November 4th, 1799, less than 4 months after their arrival in South America, Humboldt for the first time felt the danger that might threaten his life and his plans. It was a hot and humid day. At midday, dark clouds rolled in, and by 4 p.m., thunderclaps reverberated across the town. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble, almost knocking Bonpland to the floor as he was leaning over a table to examine some plants, and violently rocking Humboldt in his hammock. People ran screaming through the streets as houses crumbled, but Humboldt remained calm and climbed out of his hammock to set up his instruments. Even with the earth shaking, nothing would prevent him from conducting his observations. He timed the shocks, noted how the quake rippled from north to south, and took electric measurements. Yet, for all his outward composure, Humboldt experienced inner turmoil. As the ground moved beneath him, it destroyed the illusion of a whole life, he wrote. Water was the element of motion, not the earth. It was like being woken suddenly and painfully from a dream. Until that moment, he had felt an unwavering faith in the stability of nature, but he had been deceived. Now, we mistrust for the first time a soil on which we had so long placed our feet with confidence, he said. But he was still determined to continue his travels. He had waited for years to see the world, and knew that he was putting his life in danger, but he wanted to see more. 2 weeks later, and after an anxious wait to draw money with his Spanish credit note, when it failed, the governor gave Humboldt money from his private funds. They left Cumaná for Caracas. In mid-November, Humboldt and Bonpland, together with an Indian servant called José de la Cruz, chartered a small, open, 30-foot local trading boat to sail westwards. They packed their many instruments and trunks, which were already filled with more than 4,000 plant specimens, as well as insects, notebooks, and tables of measurements. Situated 3,000 feet above sea level, Caracas was home to 40,000 people. Founded by the Spanish in 1567, it was now the capital of the Captaincy General of Venezuela. 95% of the city's white population were criollos, or as Humboldt called them, Hispano-Americans, white colonists of Spanish descent, but born in South America. Though a majority, these South American Creoles had been excluded from the highest administrative and military positions for decades. The Spanish crown had sent Spaniards to control the colonies, many of whom were less educated than the Creoles. The wealthy Creole plantation owners found it infuriating to be ruled by merchants dispatched from a distant mother country. The Spanish authorities treated them, some Creoles complained, as if they were vile slaves. Caracas lay nestled in a high valley skirted by mountains near the coast. Once again, Humboldt rented a house as a base from which to launch shorter excursions. From here, Humboldt and Bonpland set out to scale the double-domed Silla, a mountain so close that they could see it from their house, but which, to Humboldt's surprise, no one he met in Caracas had ever climbed. On another day, they rode into the foothills, where they found a spring of the clearest water tumbling down a wall of shimmering rock. Observing a group of girls there fetching water, Humboldt was suddenly struck by a memory of home. That evening he wrote in his journal, "Memories of Werther, Goethe, and the King's Daughters," a reference to the sorrows of young Werther, in which Goethe had described a similar scene. On other occasions, it was the particular shape of a tree or a mountain that gave him an immediate sense of familiarity. One glimpse of the stars in the southern sky, or of the shape of the cacti against the horizon, was proof of how far away he was from his homeland. But then, all it took was the sudden tinkle of a cowbell or the roaring of a bull, and he was back in the meadows of Tegel. "Nature everywhere speaks to a man in a voice," Humboldt said, "that is familiar to his soul." These sounds were like voices from beyond the ocean that transported him in an instant from one hemisphere to another. Like the tentative pencil lines in a sketch, his new understanding of nature, based on scientific observations and feelings, was beginning to emerge. Memories and emotional responses, Humboldt realized, would always form part of man's experience and understanding of nature. Imagination was like a balm of miraculous healing properties, he said. Soon it was time to move on, inspired by the stories Humboldt had heard about the mysterious Cassiquiare River. More than half a century earlier, a Jesuit priest had reported that the Cassiquiare connected the two great river systems of South America, the Orinoco and the Amazon. The Orinoco forms a sweeping arc from its source in the south near today's border between Venezuela and Brazil to its delta on the northeastern coast of Venezuela, where it discharges into the Atlantic Ocean. Almost 1,000 miles further south along the coast is the mouth of the mighty Amazon, the river that crosses almost the entire continent from its source in the west in the Peruvian Andes, less than 100 miles from the Pacific coast, to the Brazilian Atlantic coast in the east. Deep in the rainforest, 1,000 miles to the south of Caracas, the Cassiquiare reputedly linked the network of tributaries of these two great rivers. no one had been able to prove its existence, and few believed that major rivers such as the Orinoco and the Amazon could in fact be connected. All the scientific understanding of the day suggested that the Orinoco and the Amazon basins had to be separated by a watershed, because the idea of a natural waterway linking two large rivers was against all empirical evidence. Geographers had not found a single instance where it occurred elsewhere on the globe. In fact, the most recent map of the region showed a mountain range, the suspected watershed, exactly in the location where Humboldt had heard rumors that the Cassiquiare might be. There was much to prepare. They had to choose instruments that were small enough to fit into the narrow canoes in which they would be traveling. They needed to organize money and goods to pay for guides and food, even in the deepest jungle. Before they set off, though, Humboldt dispatched letters to Europe and North America, asking his correspondents to publish them in newspapers. He understood the importance of publicity. From La Coruña in Spain, for example, Humboldt had written 43 letters just before their departure. If he died during the voyage, he would at least not be forgotten. On February 7, 1800, Humboldt, Bonpland, and José, their servant from Cumaná, departed from Caracas on 4 mules, leaving behind most of their luggage and collections. To reach the Orinoco, they would have to head south on an almost exactly straight line through the huge emptiness of the Llanos, vast plains the size of France. The plan was to go to the Rio Apure, a tributary of the Orinoco, about 200 miles to the south of Caracas. There they would procure a boat and provisions for their expedition at San Fernando de Apure, a Capuchin mission. First, though, they would go west on a 100-mile detour to see the lush valleys of Aragua, one of the wealthiest agricultural regions in the colonies. With the rainy season over, it was hot, and much of the land through which they rode was arid. They crossed mountains and valleys, and after 7 exhausting days, they finally saw the smiling valleys of Aragua. Stretching west were endless neat rows of corn, sugarcane, and indigo. In between they could see small groves of trees, little villages, farmhouses, and gardens. The farms were connected by paths lined with flowering shrubs, and the houses shaded by large trees, tall ceibas clothed in thick yellow blossoms, with their branches plaited into the flamboyant orange blooms of coral trees. In the midst of the valley, and surrounded by mountains, was Lake Valencia. About a dozen rocky islands dotted the lake, some large enough to pasture goats and to farm. At sunset, thousands of herons, flamingos, and wild ducks brought the sky alive as they flew across the lake to roost on the islands. It looked idyllic, but, as the locals told Humboldt, the lake's water levels were falling rapidly. Vast swaths of land that only 2 decades earlier had been underwater were now densely cultivated fields. What had once been islands were now hillocks on dry land, as the shoreline continued to recede. Lake Valencia also had a unique ecosystem. With no outflow to the ocean, and only small brooks running in, its water levels were regulated by evaporation alone. The locals believed that an underground outlet drained the lake, but Humboldt had other ideas. He measured, examined, and questioned. When he found fine sands on the higher levels of the islands, he realized that they had once been submerged. He also compared the annual average evaporation of rivers and lakes across the world, from southern France to the West Indies. As he investigated, he concluded that the clearing of the surrounding forests, as well as the diversion of water for irrigation, had caused the falling water levels. As agriculture had flourished in the valley, planters had drained and diverted some of the brooks that fed into the lake to irrigate their fields. They had felled trees to clear land, and with it the forest's undergrowth, moss, brushwood, and root systems had disappeared, leaving the soils beneath exposed to the elements and incapable of water retention. Just outside Cumaná, locals had already told him that the dryness of the land had increased in tandem with the clearing of ancient groves. and on the way from Caracas to the Aragua Valley, Humboldt had noted the dry soils and bemoaned that the first colonists had imprudently destroyed the forest. As the soils had become depleted and fields had yielded less, the planters had moved west along a path of destruction. "Forest very decimated," Humboldt scribbled in his diary. Just a few decades previously, the mountains and foothills that surrounded the Aragua Valley in Lake Valencia had been forested. Now, with the trees felled, heavy rains had washed away the soil. All this was closely connected, Humboldt concluded, because in the past the forests had shielded the soil from the sun and thereby diminished the evaporation of the moisture. It was here, at Lake Valencia, that Humboldt developed his idea of human-induced climate change. When he published his observations, he left no doubt what he thought. When forests are destroyed, as they are everywhere in America by the European planters, with an imprudent precipitation, the springs are entirely dried up or become less abundant. The beds of the rivers, remaining dry during a part of the year, are converted into torrents whenever great rains fall on the heights. The sward and moss disappearing with the brushwood from the sides of the mountains, the waters falling in rain are no longer impeded in their course, and instead of slowly augmenting the level of the rivers by progressive filtrations, they furrow during heavy showers the sides of the hills, bear down the loosened soil, and form those sudden inundations that devastate the country. A few years earlier, when working as a mining inspector, Humboldt had already noted the excessive clearing of forests for timber and fuel in the Fichtel Mountains near Bayreuth. His letters and reports from that time were peppered with suggestions on how to reduce the need for timber in mines and ironworks. He had not been the first to comment on this, but previously the reasons for concern had been economical rather than environmental. Forests provided the fuel for manufacturing, and timber was not only an important building material for houses, but also for ships, which in turn were essential for empires and naval powers. Timber was the oil of the 17th and 18th centuries, and any shortages created similar anxieties about fuel, manufacturing, and transport as threats to oil production do today. As early as 1664, the English gardener and writer John Evelyn had written a best-selling book on forestry, Silva, A Discourse of Forest Trees, in which he addressed timber shortage as a national crisis. "We had better be without gold than without timber," Evelyn had declared, because without trees there would be no iron and glass industries, no blazing fires warming homes during cold winter nights, nor a navy to protect the shores of England. 5 years later, in 1669, the French Minister of Finance, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, had outlawed much of the communal right to use the forests in villages, and had planted trees for the Navy's future use. "France will perish for the want of wood," he had said, on introducing his draconian measures. There had even been some lone voices in the vast lands of the North American colonies. In 1749, the American farmer and plant collector John Bartram had lamented that timber will soon be very much destroyed, a concern echoed by his friend Benjamin Franklin, who had also feared the loss for wood. As a solution, Franklin had invented a fuel-efficient fireplace. Now, at Lake Valencia, Humboldt began to understand deforestation in a wider context and projected his local analysis forward to warn that the agricultural techniques of his day could have devastating consequences. The action of humankind across the globe, he warned, could affect future generations. What he saw at Lake Valencia he would see again and again, from Lombardy in Italy to southern Peru, and many decades later in Russia. As Humboldt described how humankind was changing the climate, he unwittingly became the father of the environmental movement. Humboldt was the first to explain the fundamental functions of the forest for the ecosystem and climate, the trees' ability to store water and to enrich the atmosphere with moisture, their protection of the soil, and their cooling effect. He also talked about the impact of trees on the climate through their release of oxygen. The effects of the human species intervention were already incalculable, Humboldt insisted, and could become catastrophic if they continued to disturb the world so brutally. Humboldt would see again and again how humankind unsettled the balance of nature. Only a few weeks later, deep in the Orinoco rainforest, he would observe how some Spanish monks in a remote mission illuminated their ramshackle churches with oil harvested from turtle eggs. As a consequence, the local population of turtles had already been substantially reduced. Every year, the turtles would lay their eggs along the river's beach, but instead of leaving some eggs to hatch the next generation, the missionaries collected so many that with every passing year, as the natives told Humboldt, their numbers had shrunk. Earlier, at the Venezuelan coast, Humboldt had also noted how unchecked pearl fishing had completely depleted the oyster stocks. It was all an ecological chain reaction. Everything, Humboldt later said, is interaction and reciprocal. Humboldt was turning away from the human-centered perspective that had ruled humankind's approach to nature for millennia. From Aristotle, who had written that nature has made all things specifically for the sake of man, to botanist Carl Linnaeus, who had still echoed the same sentiment more than 2,000 years later, in 1749, when he insisted that all things are made for the sake of man. It had long been believed that God had given humans command over nature. After all, didn't the Bible say that man should be fruitful, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over fish of the sea, and over fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth? In the 17th century, the British philosopher Francis Bacon had declared, "The world is made for man," while René Descartes had argued that animals were effectively automata, complex perhaps, but not capable of reason, and therefore inferior to humans. Humans, Descartes had written, were the lords and possessors of nature. In the 18th century, ideas of the perfectibility of nature dominated Western thinking. Humankind would make nature better through cultivation, it was believed, and improvement was the mantra. Orderly fields, cleared forests, and neat villages turned a savage wilderness into pleasing and productive landscapes. The primeval forest of the New World, by contrast, was a howling wilderness that had to be conquered. Chaos had to be ordered, and evil had to be transformed into good. In 1748, the French thinker Montesquieu had written that humankind had rendered the earth more proper for their abode, with their hands and tools making the earth habitable. Orchards loaded with fruits, tidy vegetable gardens, and meadows grazed by cattle were the ideal of nature at the time. It was a model that would long rule the Western world. Almost a century after Montesquieu's assertion, the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville, during a visit to the United States in 1833, thought that it was the idea of destruction of man's acts in the American wilderness that gave the landscape its touching loveliness. Some North American thinkers even argued that the climate had changed for the better since the first settlers arrived. With every tree that was cut from the virgin forest, they insisted, the air had become healthier and milder. Lack of evidence didn't stop them from preaching their theories. One such was Hugh Williamson, a physician and politician from North Carolina, who published an article in 1770 that celebrated the clearing of huge swaths of forests, which, he claimed, was to the benefit of the climate. Others believed that clearing the forests would increase winds, which in turn would carry healthier air across the land. Only 6 years before Humboldt's visit to Lake Valencia, one American had proposed that felling trees in the interior of the continent would be a useful way of drying up the marshes along the coast. The few voices of concern remained restricted to private letters and conversations. On the whole, the subduing of the wilderness, most agreed, was the foundation for future profit. The man who had probably done most to spread this view was the French naturalist Georges Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. During the mid-18th century, Buffon had painted a picture of the primeval forest as a horrendous place full of decaying trees, rotting leaves, parasitic plants, stagnant pools, and venomous insects. The wilderness, he said, was deformed. Though Buffon had died the year before the French Revolution, his views of the New World still shaped public opinion. Beauty was equated with utility, and every acre wrested from the wilderness was a victory of civilized man over uncivilized nature. It was cultivated nature, Buffon had written, that was beautiful. Humboldt, however, warned that humankind needed to understand how the forces of nature worked, how those different threads were all connected. Humans could not just change the natural world at their will and to their advantage. Man can only act upon nature and appropriate her forces to his use, Humboldt would later write, by comprehending her laws. Humankind, he warned, had the power to destroy the environment, and the consequences could be. 5. The Llanos and the Orinoco. After 3 weeks of intense investigations at Lake Valencia and the surrounding valley, Humboldt finished his observations. It was time to turn south towards the Orinoco, but first they had to cross the Llanos. On March 10, 1800, almost exactly a month after leaving Caracas, Humboldt and his small team entered the bleak, tussocky grassland of the Llanos. The land was crusted in dust. The plains seemed to stretch out forever, and the horizon danced in the heat. They saw clumps of dried grass and palms, but not much else. The relentless sun had baked the ground into a cracked, hard surface. Sticking his thermometer in the ground, Humboldt recorded a temperature of 50 degrees Celsius. Having left behind the densely populated Aragua Valley, Humboldt felt suddenly plunged into a vast solitude. Some days the air stood so still, he wrote in his journal, that everything seems motionless. With no clouds to shade them as they trekked across the hardened soil, they stuffed their hats with leaves as insulation against the burning heat. Humboldt wore loose-fitting trousers, a waistcoat, and simple linen shirts. He had a coat for colder climates and always wore a soft white necktie. He had chosen the most comfortable European clothes available at the time, light and easily washable, but even dressed like this, he found it unbearably hot. In the Llanos they encountered dust devils, and frequent mirages conjured up cruel promises of cool and refreshing water. Sometimes they traveled during the night to avoid the scorching sun. They often went thirsty and hungry. One day they came across a small farm, nothing more than a solitary house with a few small huts around it. Covered in dust and burned by the sun, the men were desperate for a bath. With the landowner absent, the foreman pointed them to a nearby pool. The water was murky, but at least a little cooler than the air. Excitedly, Humboldt and Bonpland stripped off their dirty clothes, but just as they stepped into the pool, an alligator that had been lying motionless on the opposite bank decided to join them. Within seconds, the two men had jumped out and grabbed their clothes, running for their lives. Although the Llanos might have been an inhospitable environment, Humboldt was enthralled by the vastness of the landscape. There was something about the flatness and its daunting size that fills the mind with the feeling of infinity, he wrote. Then, about halfway across the plains, they reached the small trading town of Calabozo. When locals told Humboldt that many of the shallow pools in the area were infested with electric eels, he couldn't believe his luck. Since his experiments with animal electricity in Germany, Humboldt had always wanted to examine one of these extraordinary fish. He had heard strange tales about the 5-foot-long creatures that could deliver electric shocks of more than 600 volts. The problem was how to catch the eels, given that they lived buried in the mud at the bottom of the pools and thus could not be easily netted. The eels were also so highly charged that touching them would mean instant death. The locals had an idea. They rounded up 30 wild horses in the Llanos and drove the herd into the pond. As the horses' hooves churned up the mud, the eels wriggled up to the surface, giving off enormous electric shocks. Entranced, Humboldt watched the gruesome spectacle. The horses screamed in pain, the eels thrashed beneath their bellies, and the water's surface boiled with movement. Some horses fell and, trampled by the others, drowned. Over time, the strength of the electric shocks diminished, and the weakened eels retreated into the mud, from where Humboldt pulled them with dry wooden sticks. But he hadn't waited long enough. When he and Bonpland dissected some of the animals, they endured violent shocks themselves. For 4 hours they conducted an array of dangerous tests, including holding an eel with 2 hands, touching an eel with 1 hand and a bit of metal with the other, or Humboldt touching an eel while holding Bonpland's hand, with Bonpland feeling the jolt. Sometimes they stood on dry ground, at others on wet. They attached electrodes, poked the eels with wet sticks of sealing wax, and picked them up with wet clay and fiber cords made from palms. No material was left untested. Unsurprisingly, by the end of the day, Humboldt and Bonpland felt sick and feeble. The eels also made Humboldt think about electricity and magnetism in general. Watching the grisly encounter between eels and horses, Humboldt thought of the forces that, variously, created lightning, bound metal to metal, and moved the needles of compasses. As so often, Humboldt started with a detail or an observation, and then spun out to the greater context. "All flow forth from one source," he wrote, "and all melt together in an eternal, all-encompassing power." At the end of March 1800, almost 2 months after leaving Caracas, Humboldt and Bonpland finally reached the Capuchin mission in San Fernando de Apure at the Rio Apure. From here they would paddle east along the Rio Apure and through the rainforest to the lower Orinoco, a distance of about 100 miles as the crow flies, but more than double that length along the looping river bends. Once they reached the confluence of the Rio Apure and the lower Orinoco, their intention was to travel south along the Orinoco and across the great Atures and Maipures rapids, deep into a region where few white men had ever gone. Here they hoped to find the Cassiquiare, the fabled link between the great Amazon and Orinoco. The boat they had acquired in San Fernando de Apure was launched into the Rio Apure on March 30th, heavily loaded with provisions for 4 weeks, not enough for the entire expedition, but all they could fit into the vessel. From the Capuchin monks they bought bananas, cassava roots, chickens, and cacao, as well as the pod-like fruits of the tamarind tree, which they were told turned the river water into a refreshing lemonade. The rest of the food they would have to catch, fish, turtle eggs, birds, and other game, and barter for more with the indigenous tribes with the alcohol they had packed. Unlike most European explorers, Humboldt and Bonpland were not traveling with a large retinue. Simply 4 locals to paddle and 1 pilot to steer their boat, their servant José from Cumaná, and the brother-in-law of the provincial governor who had joined them. Humboldt didn't mind the loneliness. Far from it. There was nothing here to interrupt study. Nature provided more than enough stimulation, and he had Bonpland as his scientific colleague and friend. The past few months had made them trusted travel companions. Humboldt's instincts when he had met Bonpland in Paris had been correct. Bonpland was an excellent field botanist who didn't seem to mind the hardships of their adventures, and who remained calm even in the most adverse situations. More importantly, no matter what happened, Bonpland was always cheerful, Humboldt said. As they paddled along the Rio Apure and then the Orinoco, a new world unfolded. From their boat, they had the perfect view. Hundreds of large crocodiles basked on the river shore with their snouts open. Many were 15 feet long or more. Completely motionless, the crocodiles looked like tree trunks, until they suddenly slid into the water. There were so many that there was hardly a moment when they didn't see one. Their large, jagged tail scales reminded Humboldt of the dragons in his childhood books. Huge boa constrictors swam past their boat. But despite such dangers, the men bathed every day in careful rotation, with one man washing while the others looked out for animals. Traveling along the river, they also encountered great herds of capybaras, the world's largest rodents, which lived in large family groups and paddled in the water like dogs. The capybaras looked like giant blunt-nosed guinea pigs, weighing around 50 kilograms or more. Even bigger were the pig-sized tapirs, shy and solitary animals that foraged for leaves with their fleshy snouts in the thickets along the riverside, and beautifully spotted jaguars that preyed on them. Some nights Humboldt could hear the snoring sounds of river dolphins against the perpetual background hum of insects. The men passed islands that were home to thousands of flamingos, white herons, and pink-colored spoonbills with their large spatula-shaped beaks. They traveled during the day and camped on the sandy riverbanks at night, always placing their instruments and collections at the center, with their hammocks and several fires forming a protective circle around. If possible, they fastened their hammocks to the trees or to the oars, which they stuck upright into the ground. Finding wood dry enough for their fires in the dripping wet jungle was often difficult, but an essential defense against jaguars and other animals. The rainforest made for treacherous traveling. One night, one of the Indian oarsmen woke to find a snake curled up under the animal skin on which he had been sleeping. On another, the entire camp was woken by Bonpland's sudden scream. Something furry and with sharp claws had landed on top of him with a heavy thump when he was fast asleep in his hammock. A jaguar, Bonpland thought, as he lay rigid with fear. But when Humboldt crept closer, he saw that it was only a tame cat from a nearby tribal settlement. Then, a couple of days later, Humboldt almost walked into a jaguar hiding in the thick foliage. Terrified, Humboldt remembered what the guides had told him. Slowly, without running or moving his arms, he walked backwards, away from the danger. The animals weren't the only hazard. On one occasion, Humboldt was almost killed when he accidentally touched some curare. It was a deadly, paralyzing poison that he had collected from an indigenous tribe and which had leaked from its container into his clothing. The tribes used it as arrow poison for their blowguns, and Humboldt was fascinated by the curare's potency. He was the first European to describe its preparation, but it also almost cost him his life. Had more poison seeped out, he would have suffered an agonizing death by suffocation, as the curare paralyzed the diaphragm and muscles. Despite the danger, Humboldt was captivated by the jungle. At night, he loved to listen to the monkeys' choir, picking out the different contributions from the various species, ranging from the deafening bellows of the howler monkeys that ricocheted through the jungle across great distances to the soft, almost flute-like tones and snorting grumblings of others. The forest teemed with life. There are many voices proclaiming to us that all nature breathes, Humboldt wrote. This, unlike the agricultural region around Lake Valencia, was a primeval world where man did not disturb the course of nature. Here, he could truly study animals that he had only seen as stuffed specimens in Europe's natural history collections. They caught birds and monkeys, which they kept in large, wide-meshed reed baskets or chained to long ropes in the hope of sending them back to Europe. The titi monkeys were Humboldt's favorites. Small, with long tails and soft, grayish fur, they had a white face that looked like a heart-shaped mask, Humboldt noted. They were beautiful and graceful in their movements, easily jumping from branch to branch, which gave them their German name, Springaffe, jumping monkey. Titi monkeys were extremely difficult to catch alive. The only way, they discovered, was to kill a mother with a blowgun and a poisoned dart. The titi youngster would not let go of its mother, even as she came crashing down the tree. Humboldt's team had to be quick to catch and tear the young monkey away from its dead mother. One that they had captured was so clever that it always tried to grab at the engravings in Humboldt's scientific books depicting grasshoppers and wasps. To Humboldt's amazement, the monkey seemed able to distinguish engravings that showed its favorite foods, such as the insects, while pictures of human and mammal skeletons didn't interest the Titi at all. There was no better place to observe animals and plants. Humboldt had entered the most magnificent web of life on Earth, a network of active organic powers, as he later wrote. Enthralled, he pursued every thread. Everything bore witness to the power and the tenderness of nature, Humboldt wrote home with swagger, from the boa constrictor that can swallow a horse to the tiny hummingbird balancing itself on a delicate blossom. This was a world pulsating with life, Humboldt said, a world in which man is nothing. One night, when he was yet again woken by a piercing orchestra of animal screams, he unpeeled the chain of reaction. His Indian guides had told him that these outbreaks of noise were simply the animals worshipping the moon. Far from it, Humboldt thought, realizing that the cacophony was a long-extended and ever-amplifying battle of the animals. The jaguars were hunting in the night, chasing tapirs, which escaped noisily through the dense undergrowth, which in turn scared the monkeys sleeping in the treetops above. As the monkeys then began to cry out, their clamor woke the birds, and thus the whole animal world. Life stirred in every bush, in the cracked bark of trees, and in the soil. The whole commotion, Humboldt said, was the result of some contest in the depth of the rainforest. Again and again during his travels, Humboldt witnessed these battles. Capybaras rushed from the water to escape the deadly jaws of the crocodiles, only to run straight into the jaguars, waiting for them at the edge of the jungle. It had been the same with the flying fish that he had observed on their sea voyage. As they had jumped out of the ocean, away from the dolphin's sharp teeth, they were caught mid-air by albatrosses. It was the absence of man, Humboldt noted, that allowed animals to prosper abundantly, but it was a development that was limited only by themselves, by their mutual pressure. This was a web of life in a relentless and bloody battle, an idea that was very different from the prevailing view of nature as a well-oiled machine in which every animal and plant had a divinely allotted place. Carl Linnaeus, for example, had recognized the idea of a food chain when he talked of hawks feeding on small birds on spiders, spiders on dragonflies, dragonflies on hornets, and hornets on aphids, but he had regarded this chain as a harmonious balance. Each animal and plant had its God-given purpose and reproduced accordingly, in just the right numbers to keep this balance stable in perpetuity. Yet what Humboldt saw was no Eden. The golden age has ceased, he wrote. These animals feared each other, and they fought for survival. And it wasn't just the animals. He also noted how vigorous climbing plants were strangling huge trees in the jungle. Here it was not the destructive hand of man, he said, but the plants' competition for light and nourishment that limited their lives and growth. As Humboldt and Bonpland continued their journey up the Orinoco, their Indian crew often paddled for more than 12 hours in the sweltering heat. The current was strong, and the river was almost 2.5 miles wide. Then, 3 weeks after they had first launched their boat into the Rio Apure, and after 10 days on the Orinoco, the river narrowed. They were coming closer to the Atures and Maipures rapids. Here, more than 500 miles south of Caracas, the Orinoco forged through a mountain chain in a series of small river passages of around 150 yards wide, surrounded by huge granite boulders covered in dense forest. Over several miles, the rapids descended in hundreds of rocky steps, the water roaring and whirling and throwing up a perpetual mist that hovered over the river. The rocks and islands were clothed in lush tropical plants. These were majestic scenes of nature, Humboldt wrote. Magical it was, but also dangerous. One day, a sudden gale almost capsized their boat. As one end of the canoe began to sink, Humboldt managed to grab his diary, but books and dried plants were catapulted into the river. He was certain they were going to die. Knowing that the river was alive with crocodiles and snakes, everybody panicked, except for Bonpland, who remained calm and began to bail out the water with some hollow gourds. "Do not worry, my friend," he said to Humboldt. "We're going to be safe." Bonpland displayed that coolness, Humboldt later noted, that he always had in difficult situations. As it was, they lost only one book and were able to dry their plants and journals. Their pilot, though, was bemused about the white men, the blancos, as he called them, who seemed to worry more about their books and collections than their lives. The greatest nuisance was the mosquitoes. No matter how fascinated Humboldt was by this strange world, it was impossible not to be distracted by the insects' relentless attacks. The explorers tried everything, but neither protective clothing and smoking helped, nor their constant waving of arms and palm leaves. Humboldt and Bonpland were bitten all the time. Their skin was swollen and itchy, and whenever they talked, they started to cough and sneeze, because the mosquitoes were flying straight into their mouth and nostrils. It was torture to dissect a plant or observe the skies with their instruments. Humboldt wished that he had a third hand to fend off the mosquitoes. He always felt that he had to drop either his sextant or a leaf. Under permanent assault from the mosquitoes, Bonpland found it impossible to dry the plants out in the open, and took to using the native tribe's so-called hornitos, small windowless chambers that they used as ovens. He crept on all fours through a low opening into the hornito, in which a small fire of wet branches and leaves created a great deal of smoke, fabulous against the mosquitoes, but awful for Bonpland. Once inside, he closed the narrow entrance and spread out his plants. The heat was suffocating and the smoke almost unbearable, but anything was better than being eaten alive by the mosquitoes. Their expedition was not exactly a pleasure cruise, Humboldt said. During this part of the journey, deep in the rainforest, and at the section of the Orinoco that runs along today's Venezuelan-Colombian border, they saw few people. When they passed one mission, a missionary there, Father Bernardo Thea, was so excited to meet them that he offered to join them as a guide, which they happily accepted. Humboldt acquired a few more team members, including a stray mastiff, 8 monkeys, 7 parrots, a toucan, a macaw with purple feathers, and several other birds. Humboldt called them his traveling menagerie. Their unsteady boat was small, and to make space for their animals, as well as for their instruments and trunks, they built a platform of woven branches that extended out over the edge. Covered with a low thatched roof, it created extra space, but was claustrophobic. Humboldt and Bonpland spent many days cooped up and lying flat on this extended platform, with their legs exposed to vicious insects, rain, or burning sun. It felt like being buried alive, Humboldt wrote in his diary. For a man as restless as him, it was agony. As they went further, the forest came so close to the river that it was difficult to find any space for their nightly camps. They were running low on food, and they filtered the fetid river water through linen cloth. They ate fish, turtle eggs, and sometimes fruit, as well as smoked ants crushed up in cassava flour, which Father Thea declared an excellent ant pâté. When they couldn't find food, they suppressed their hunger by eating small portions of dry cacao powder. For 3 weeks they paddled south on the Orinoco, and then further south for another 2 weeks on a network of tributaries along the Rio Atabapo and Rio Negro. Then, as they reached the most southerly point of their river expedition, with their supplies at their lowest, they found huge nuts which they cracked open for their nutritious seeds, the magnificent Brazil nut that Humboldt subsequently introduced to Europe. Though food was scarce, the floral riches abounded. Wherever they turned, there was something new, but collecting plants was more often than not frustrating. What they could pick up on the forest floor were trifles compared to the sculptural blossoms they could see swaying high above them in the canopy, tantalizingly close, but too far away for them to reach. And what they could collect often disintegrated before their eyes in the humidity. Bonpland lost most of the specimens that he had so painfully dried in the Hornitos. They heard birds they never saw and animals they couldn't catch. They often failed to describe them properly. The scientists in Europe, Humboldt mused, would be disappointed. It was a shame, he wrote in his diary, that the monkeys didn't open their mouths as their canoe passed them so that they could count their teeth. Humboldt was interested in everything, the plants, the animals, the rocks, and the water. Like a wine connoisseur, he sampled the water of the various different rivers. The Orinoco had a singular flavor that was particularly disgusting, he noted, while the Rio Apure tasted different at various locations, and the Rio Atabapo was delicious. He observed the stars, described the landscape, and was curious about the indigenous people they met, and always wanted to learn more. He was fascinated by their worship of nature, and thought them excellent geographers, because they could find their way even through the densest jungle. They were the best observers of nature he had ever encountered. They knew every plant and animal in the rainforest, and could distinguish trees by the taste of their bark alone, an experiment that Humboldt tried and failed miserably. All 15 of the trees he sampled tasted exactly the same to him. Unlike most Europeans, Humboldt did not regard the indigenous people as barbaric, but instead was captivated by their culture, beliefs, and languages. In fact, he talked about the barbarism of civilized man when he saw how the local people were treated by colonists and missionaries. When Humboldt returned to Europe, he brought with him a completely new portrayal of the so-called savages. His only frustration came when the Indians failed to answer his many questions that were often posed through a chain of interpreters, as one local language had to be translated into another, and then another, until someone knew that language as well as Spanish. Often the content was lost in translation, and the Indians would just smile and nod in affirmation. That was not what Humboldt wanted, accusing them of an indolent indifference, although he accepted that they must be tired with our questions. To these tribal societies, Humboldt said, Europeans must seem as if always in a rush and chased by demons. One night, as the rain fell in torrents, Humboldt lay in his hammock, fastened to palm trees in the jungle. The lianas and climbing plants formed a protective shield high above him. He looked up into what seemed like a natural trellis, decorated with the long, dangling orange blossoms of heliconias and other strangely shaped flowers. Their campfire lit up this natural vault, the light of the flames licking the palm trunks up to 60 feet high. The blossoms whirled in and out of these flickering illuminations, while the white smoke of the fire spiraled into the sky, which remained invisible behind the foliage. It was bewitchingly beautiful, Humboldt said. He had described the rapids of the Orinoco, which were illuminated by the rays of the setting sun, as if a river made of mist were suspended over its bed. Though he always measured and recorded, Humboldt also wrote of how colored bows shine, vanish, and reappear at the great rapids, and of the moon encircled with colored rings. Later, he delighted in the dark river surface, which during the day reflected like a perfect mirror the blossom-loaded plants of the riverbanks, and at night the southern star constellations. No scientist had referred to nature like this before. What speaks to the soul, Humboldt said, escapes our measurements. This was not nature as a mechanistic system, but a thrilling new world filled with wonder. Seeing South America with the eyes that Goethe had given him, Humboldt was enraptured. Less pleasing was the news he received from the missionaries whom they met en route. Apparently, the fact that the Cassiquiare connected the Amazon and the Orinoco had been well known in the region for several decades. The only thing left for Humboldt was to map the course of the river properly. On May 11, 1800, they finally found the entrance to the Cassiquiare. The air was so saturated with humidity that Humboldt could see neither the sun nor the stars, without which he would not be able to determine the geographical position of the river, and hence his map would not be precise. But when their Indian guide predicted clear skies, they pressed on northeast. During the nights they tried to sleep in their hammocks along the river banks, but found rest almost impossible. One night they were chased out by columns of ants marching up the ropes of their hammocks, and on others they were tormented by the mosquitoes. As they paddled on, the vegetation grew denser. The embankment was like a living palisade, as Humboldt described it, green walls covered in leaves and lianas. Soon they couldn't find a place to sleep at all anymore, nor even get out of the canoe to go ashore. At least the weather was improving, and Humboldt could take the necessary observations for his map. Then, 10 days after they had first entered the Cassiquiare, they reached the Orinoco again. The missionaries had been correct. It had not been necessary to travel all the way south to the Amazon, because Humboldt had proved that the Cassiquiare was a natural waterway between the Orinoco and the Rio Negro. Since the Rio Negro was a tributary of the Amazon, it was clear that the two great river basins were indeed connected. And though Humboldt had not discovered the Cassiquiare, he had made a detailed map of the complex tributary system of these rivers. This map was a great improvement on all previous ones, which, he said, were as imaginary as if they had been invented in Madrid. On June 13, 1800, having raced downstream towards the north and then east along the Orinoco for 3 more weeks, they arrived in Angostura, today's Ciudad Bolivar, a small bustling town on the Orinoco, a little less than 250 miles south of Cumaná. After 1,400 miles and 75 days of grueling river traveling, Angostura, with its 6,000 inhabitants, seemed like a metropolis to Humboldt and Bonpland. Even the humblest dwelling appeared magnificent, and the smallest convenience became a luxury. They cleaned their clothes, sorted their collections, and prepared for their ride back across the Llanos. They had survived mosquitoes, jaguars, hunger, and other dangers, but just as they thought the worst was over, Bonpland and Humboldt were suddenly struck down by a violent fever. Humboldt recovered quickly, but Bonpland was soon fighting for his life. When the fever slowly ebbed after 2 long weeks, it was replaced by dysentery. Embarking on the long journey across the Llanos in the middle of the rainy season would be too dangerous for Bonpland. They waited a month in Angostura until Bonpland had regained enough strength for the journey to the coast, from where they intended to catch a boat to Cuba, and from there to Acapulco in Mexico. Once again their trunks were loaded onto mules, with cages of monkeys and parrots dangling off their sides. The new collections had added so much weight to their luggage that progress was now tediously slow. At the end of July 1800, they stepped out of the rainforest into the open space of the Llanos. After weeks in the dense jungle, where the stars appeared as if viewed from the bottom of a well, it was a revelation. Humboldt felt a sense of freedom that made him want to gallop across the wide plains. The sensation of seeing everything around him felt completely new. Infinity of space, as poets have said in every language, Humboldt now mused, is reflected in ourself. In the 4 months since they had first seen the Llanos, the rainy season had transformed the formerly bleak steppes into a partial seascape, in which huge lakes and newly filled rivers were surrounded by carpets of fresh grass. But as the air turned into water, it was even hotter than it had been during their first crossing. The grasses and blooms spread their sweet fragrance across the expanse. Jaguars hid in the high grass, and thousands of birds sang in the early morning hours. The flatness of the Llanos was only interrupted by an occasional Mauritia palm. Tall and slender, these palms spread out their fingered fronds like huge fans. They were now loaded with shiny reddish edible fruits that reminded Humboldt of fir cones, and which seemed to possess a particular allure for their monkeys, who stretched out to grab them through the bars of their cages. Humboldt had seen the palms already in the rainforest, but here in the Llanos They had a unique function. "We observed with astonishment," he reported, "how many things are connected with the existence of a single plant. The Mauritia fruits attracted birds, the leaves shielded the wind, and the soil that had blown in and accumulated behind the trunks retained more moisture than anywhere else in the Llanos, sheltering insects and worms. Just the sight of these palms, Humboldt thought, produced a feeling of coolness. This one tree, he said, spreads life around it in the desert." Humboldt had discovered the idea of a keystone species, a species that is as essential for an ecosystem as a keystone is to an arch, almost 200 years before the concept was named. For Humboldt, the Mauritia palm was the tree of life, the perfect symbol of nature as a living organism. 6. Across the Andes. After 6 months of strenuous travel in the rainforest and the Llanos, Humboldt and Bonpland returned to Cumaná in late August 1800. They were exhausted, but as soon as they had recovered and sorted their collections, they left again. In late November they sailed north for Cuba, where they arrived in mid-December. Then, one morning in Havana in early 1801, Humboldt opened the newspapers just as they were preparing to leave for Mexico, and read an article that made him change his plans. The newspaper reported that Captain Nicolas Baudin, whose expedition he had tried to join 3 years earlier in France, was sailing around the world after all. Back in 1798, when Humboldt had tried to find a passage out of Europe, the French government had not been able to finance the voyage, but now, so Humboldt read, Baudin had been equipped with 2 ships, the Géographe and the Naturaliste, and was on his way to South America, from where he would sail across the South Pacific to Australia. The most obvious route would be for Baudin to stop in Lima, Humboldt guessed, and calculated that if all went to plan, the Géographe and Naturaliste would probably arrive there by the end of 1801. The timing would be tight, but Humboldt now decided to try to join Baudin in Peru, and then to continue with him on to Australia, instead of going to Mexico. Of course, Humboldt had no way of letting Baudin know where and when to rendezvous, nor did he know if the captain was even going to sail via Lima, or whether there was any space on the ship for 2 extra scientists. But the more obstacles that were thrown into his path, the more I hastened their executions. To ensure the safety of their collections, and to avoid carrying them across the globe, Humboldt and Bonpland now began frantically to make copies of their notes and manuscripts. They sorted and packed up everything they had hoarded over the past 1.5 years to send to Europe. It was very uncertain, almost improbable, Humboldt wrote to a friend in Berlin, that he and Bonpland would survive a voyage around the globe. It made sense to get at least some of their treasures to Europe. All they retained was a small herbarium, a book filled with pressed plant specimens, so that they could compare any new species they found. A larger herbarium would remain in Havana for their return. With the European nations still at war, sea voyages remained perilous, and Humboldt feared that his valuable specimens might be captured by one of the many enemy vessels. To spread the risk, Bonpland suggested splitting the collection. One large delivery was dispatched to France, and another to Germany via England, with instructions that, if seized by the enemy, it was to be forwarded on to Joseph Banks in London. Since his return from Cook's Endeavour voyage 30 years previously, Banks had set up such a wide-ranging and global plant-collecting network that sea captains from all nations knew his name. Banks had also always tried to help French scientists by providing them with passports, despite the Napoleonic Wars, in the belief that the international community of scientists transcended war and national interests. The science of 2 nations may be at peace, he said, while their politics are at war. Humboldt's specimens would be safe with Banks. Humboldt dispatched letters home, assuring his friends and family that he was happy and healthier than ever before. He described their adventures in detail, from the dangers of jaguars and snakes to the glorious tropical landscapes and strange blossoms. Humboldt was unable to resist ending a letter to the wife of one of his closest friends with, "And you, dearest, how is your monotonous life?" Once the letters were posted and the collections dispatched, Humboldt and Bonpland sailed in mid-March 1801 from Cuba to Cartagena, on the northern coast of New Granada, now Colombia. They arrived 2 weeks later, on March 30th. Once again, though, Humboldt added a detour. Not only would he try to reach Lima by the end of December to meet Baudin's expedition, but he would do so overland rather than by taking the easier sea route. On the way, Humboldt and Bonpland would cross, climb, and investigate the Andes, the chain of mountains that runs from north to south in several spines along the length of South America, some 4,500 miles from Venezuela and Colombia in the north, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. It was the longest mountain range in the world, and Humboldt wanted to climb Chimborazo, a beautiful snow-capped volcano south of Quito, in today's Ecuador. At almost 21,000 feet, Chimborazo was believed to be the highest mountain in the world. This journey of around 2,500 miles from Cartagena to Lima would take the men through some of the harshest landscapes imaginable, pushing them to their physical limits. The lure was that they would travel through regions where no scientist had ever been before. When one is young and active, Humboldt said, it was easy not to think too much about the uncertainties and perils involved. If they wanted to meet Baudin in Lima, they had less than 9 months. First, they would travel from Cartagena along the Rio Magdalena towards Bogotá, today's capital of Colombia, from where they would march through the Andes to Quito, and then further south, all the way to Lima. But all difficulties, Humboldt told himself, could be conquered with energy. On their way south, Humboldt also wanted to meet the celebrated Spanish botanist José Celestino Mutis, who lived in Bogotá. The 69-year-old Mutis had arrived from Spain 4 decades earlier and had led many expeditions through the region. No other botanist knew so much about South American flora, and in Bogotá, Humboldt hoped to compare his collections with those that Mutis had accumulated during his long career. Though he had heard that Mutis could be difficult and guarded, Humboldt hoped to win him over. Mutis so close, he thought, when they arrived in Cartagena, from where he sent the botanist a very artificial letter, laced with praise and flattery. The only reason why he wasn't sailing to Lima from Cartagena, Humboldt now wrote to Mutis, but had chosen the far more arduous route across the Andes, was to meet him in Bogotá on the way. On April 6th, they left Cartagena to reach the Rio Magdalena, some 60 miles to the east. They walked through dense forests lit by fireflies, their signposts in the dark, as Humboldt said, and spent a few miserable nights sleeping on their coats on the hard ground. 2 weeks later, they pushed their canoe into the Rio Magdalena, traveling south towards Bogotá. For almost 2 months they paddled upstream against a strong current and along thick forests that ribboned the river. It was the rainy season, and once again they encountered crocodiles, mosquitoes, and unbearable humidity. On June 15th they arrived in Honda, a small river port of about 4,000 people, less than 100 miles northwest of Bogotá. They now had to ascend from the river valley along rugged, steep paths to a plateau that was almost 9,000 feet high and on which Bogotá was situated. Bonpland was struggling with the thin air, feeling nauseous and feverish. It made for exhausting traveling, but their arrival in Bogotá on July 8, 1801, was triumphal. Greeted by Mutis and the city's luminaries, the men found themselves rushed from one feast to another. No one had seen such festivities in Bogotá for decades. Humboldt had never enjoyed rigid ceremony, but Mutis explained that it would all have to be endured for the sake of the viceroy and the city's leading inhabitants. After that, though, the old botanist opened his cabinets. Mutis also had a botanical drawing studio where 32 artists, some Indians among them, would eventually produce 6,000 different watercolors of indigenous plants. Even better, Mutis owned so many botanical books, as Humboldt later told his brother, that his collection was only surpassed by Joseph Banks's library in London. This was an invaluable resource because it had been 2 years since Humboldt had left Europe, and this was the first time he could leaf through a vast selection of books, checking, comparing, and cross-referencing his own observations. The visit brought advantages for both men. Mutis was flattered because he was able to show off that a European scientist had made this dangerous detour just to see him, while Humboldt received the botanical information he needed. Then, just as they were preparing to leave Bogotá, Bonpland was struck down by a recurrence of his fever. It took him several weeks to recover, leaving them even less time to cross the Andes en route to Lima. On September 8th, exactly 2 months after their arrival, they finally bade farewell to Mutis, who gave them so much food that their 3 mules struggled to carry it all. The rest of their luggage was divided between another 8 mules and oxen, but the most delicate instruments were carried by 5 porters, local cargueros, as well as by José, the servant who had accompanied them for the past 2 years, since their arrival in Cumaná. They were ready for the Andes, even though the weather could not have been worse. From Bogotá, they crossed the first mountain chain along the Quindío Pass, a trail at almost 12,000 feet that was known to be the most dangerous and difficult in all the Andes. Battling thunderstorms, rain, and snow, they walked along a muddy path that was often only 8 inches wide. "These are the paths in the Andes," Humboldt wrote in his diary, "to which one has to entrust one's manuscripts, instruments, and collections." He was amazed how the mules managed to balance along, although it was more a patchwork falling, he said, than walking. They lost the fish and reptiles they had preserved from the Rio Magdalena when the glass jars containing them were all smashed. Within days, their shoes had been torn to shreds by the bamboo shoots that grew in the mud, and they had to continue barefoot. Their progress south towards Quito was slow as they crossed mountains and valleys. Moving up and down in altitude, they marched through fierce snowstorms before descending into the heavy heat of tropical forests. At times, they walked through dark ravines so deep and narrow that they had to grope their way blindly along the rocks, and at others they walked across sunlit meadows in the valleys. Some mornings the snow-capped peaks stood out against a pristine blue cupola, and on others they were enveloped in clouds so thick that they could see nothing. High above them, huge Andean condors spread their 3-meter-wide wings as they glided alone against the sky, solemn black except for a necklace of white feathers and their white-fringed wings that shone mirror-like against the midday sun. One night, about midway on their journey between Bogotá and Quito, they saw flames licking out of the Pasto volcano against the darkness. Humboldt had never felt further away from home. If he died now, it would be months or even years before his friends and family found out. And he had no idea what they were all doing. Was Wilhelm still in Paris, for example? Or had he and Carolina maybe moved back to Prussia? How many children did they have by now? Since leaving Spain 2.5 years before, Humboldt had only received 1 letter from his brother and 2 from an old friend, and that had been over a year ago. Somewhere between Bogotá and Quito, Humboldt's feeling of loneliness became so strong that he composed a long letter to Wilhelm, describing in great detail their adventures since his arrival in South America. "I don't get tired of writing letters to Europe," was his first line. He knew that the letter was unlikely ever to reach its destination, but it didn't really matter. Writing from the remote Andean village in which the men found themselves that night was the closest Humboldt could get to a dialogue with his brother. The next day, they rose early to continue their journey. Sometimes precipices dropped down hundreds of feet from paths so narrow that the valuable instruments and collections dangled precariously over the abyss from their mules' backs. These moments were especially tense for José, who was responsible for the barometer, the expedition's most important instrument, because Humboldt needed it to determine the height of the mountains. The barometer was a long wooden baton into which a glass tube had been inserted to hold the mercury, and although Humboldt had designed a protective box for this special travel barometer, the glass could still easily break. The instrument had cost him $12, but by the end of his 5-year expedition, that price had risen to $800, Humboldt later calculated, if he added all the money he had spent on wages for the people employed to carry it safely across Latin America. Of his several barometers, only this one had remained intact. A few weeks earlier, when the penultimate had been smashed on their way from Cartagena to the Rio Magdalena, Humboldt had been so depressed that he had collapsed onto the ground in the middle of a small town square. As he lay there on his back and looked up at the sky, so far from home and the European instrument makers, he had declared, "Lucky are those who travel without instruments that break." How on earth, he wondered, could he measure and compare the globe's mountains without his tools? When they finally arrived in Quito in early January 1802, 1,300 miles and 9 months after leaving Cartagena, they received news that the reports about Captain Baudin had been wrong. Baudin was not after all sailing to Australia via South America, but instead making for the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and from there across the Indian Ocean. Any other man would have despaired, but not Humboldt. At least now there was no rush to reach Lima, he reasoned, which gave them time to climb all the volcanoes he wanted to investigate. Humboldt was interested in volcanoes for 2 particular reasons. The first was to ascertain if they were local occurrences, or if they were linked subterraneously with each other. If they were not just local phenomena, but instead consisted of groups or clusters that stretched across huge distances, it was possible that they were connected through the core of the Earth. Humboldt's second reason was that studying volcanoes might provide an answer to how the Earth itself had been created. In the late 18th century, scientists had begun to suggest that the Earth must be older than the Bible, but they couldn't agree on how the Earth had formed. The so-called Neptunists believed that water had been the main force, creating rocks by sedimentation, slowly building up mountains, minerals, and geological formations out of a primordial ocean. Others, the volcanists, argued that everything had originated through catastrophic events, such as volcanic eruptions. The pendulum was still swinging between those 2 concepts. One problem that European scientists encountered was that their knowledge was almost entirely limited to the only 2 active volcanoes in Europe, Etna and Vesuvius in Italy. Now, Humboldt had the chance to investigate more volcanoes than anyone before him. He became so fascinated with them as the key to understanding the creation of the Earth that Goethe later joked, in a letter that introduced a female friend to Humboldt, "Since you belong to the naturalists who believe that everything was created by volcanoes, I'm sending you a female volcano who completely scorches and burns whatever is left." With his plan to join Baudin's expedition dashed, Humboldt used his new base in Quito to climb systematically every reachable volcano, no matter how dangerous. He was so busy that he caused some consternation in the parlors of Quito's high society. His good looks had attracted the attention of several young unmarried women, yet he never remained longer than was necessary at dinner or other social events, said Rosa Montufar, the daughter of the provincial governor and a noted beauty. Humboldt seemed to prefer to be outdoors, she complained, rather than in the company of attractive women. The irony was that Rosa's handsome brother, Carlos Montufar, now became Humboldt's companion, a pattern of friendship that repeated itself in Humboldt's life. He never married. In fact, he once said that a married man was always a lost man, nor did he ever seem to have any intimate relationships with women. Instead, Humboldt had regular infatuations with his male friends, to whom he wrote letters in which he confessed his undying and fervent love. And though he lived at a time when it was not uncommon for men to declare passionate feelings in their platonic friendships, Humboldt's declarations tended to be strong. "I was tied to you as by iron chains," he wrote to one friend, and cried for many hours when he left another. There had been a couple of particularly intense friendships in the years before South America. Throughout his life, Humboldt had such relationships in which he not only declared his love, but also showed, for him, an unusual submissiveness. "My plans are subordinated to yours," he wrote to one friend, "and you can order me like a child, and you will always find obedience without grumble." Humboldt's relationship with Bonpland, by contrast, was very different. Bonpland was a good person, Humboldt had written to a friend on the eve of his departure from Spain, but he has left me very cold for the past 6 months. That means I only have a scientific relationship with him. Humboldt's explicit remark that Bonpland was only a scientific colleague may have been an indication how differently he felt about other men. Contemporaries noted Humboldt's lack of true love for women, and a newspaper later insinuated that he might be homosexual when an article wrote of his sleeping partner. Carolina von Humboldt said that nothing will ever have a great influence on Alexander that doesn't come through men. Even 25 years after Humboldt's death, the German poet Theodor Fontana complained that a Humboldt biography he had just read did not mention the sexual irregularities. At 22, Carlos Montúfar was 10 years younger than Humboldt, and with dark curly hair and almost black eyes, carried himself tall and proud. He was to remain at Humboldt's side for several years. Montúfar was no scientist, but a quick learner, and Bonpland certainly didn't seem to mind the new addition to their team. Others, though, viewed the friendship with some jealousy. The South American botanist and astronomer José de Caldas had met Humboldt a few months earlier on their way to Quito, and had politely been rebuffed when he had asked to join the expedition. Annoyed, Caldas now wrote to Mutis in Bogotá that Montúfar had become Humboldt's Adonis. Humboldt never explicitly explained the nature of these male friendships, but it's likely that they remained platonic, because he admitted that, "I don't know sensual needs." Instead, he escaped into the wilderness or threw himself into strenuous activity. Great physical exertion cheered him up, and nature, he declared, calmed the wild urges of passions. And once again, he was exhausting himself. Humboldt was climbing dozens of volcanoes, sometimes with Bonpland and Montúfar, and sometimes without, but always with José, carefully carrying the precious barometer. For the next 5 months, Humboldt scaled every reachable volcano from their base in Quito. One such was Pichincha, a volcano to the west of Quito, where poor José suddenly sank and almost disappeared into a snow bridge that covered a deep crevasse. Luckily, he managed to pull himself and the barometer out. Humboldt then continued to the summit, where he lay flat on a narrow rock ledge that formed a small natural balcony over the deep crater. Every 2 or 3 minutes, violent tremors shook this little platform, but he remained unperturbed and crawled to the edge to peer over into Pichincha's deep crater. Bluish flames flickered inside, and Humboldt was almost suffocated by the sulfuric vapors. No imagination would be able to conjure up something as sinister, mournful, and deathly as we saw there, Humboldt said. He also attempted to climb Cotopaxi, a perfectly cone-shaped volcano, which, at more than 19,000 feet, is the second highest mountain in Ecuador. But snow and steep slopes prevented him from going any higher than 14,500 feet. Though he failed to reach the summit, the sight of snow-covered Cotopaxi, standing alone against the azure vault of heaven, remained one of the most majestic views he had ever seen. Cotopaxi's shape was so perfect, and its surface appeared so smooth, Humboldt wrote in his diary, that it was as if a wood-turner had created it on his lathe. On another occasion, Humboldt and his small team followed an ancient congealed stream of lava that filled a valley below Antisana, a volcano that rose to 18,714 feet. As they moved higher, the trees and shrubs became smaller until they reached the tree line and walked into the so-called Paramo above. The tufted brownish stipa grass that grew here gave the landscape an almost barren look. But on closer inspection they could see that the ground was covered in minute, colorful flowers, held tightly within little rosettes of green leaves. They found small lupins and tiny gentians, which formed soft, moss-like cushions. Wherever the men turned, delicate purple and blue blossoms dotted the grass. It was also bitterly cold, and so windy that Bonpland was knocked off his feet several times as he bent down to pick flowers. Gales blasted ice needles into their faces. Before their final climb to the summit of Antisana, they had to spend the night in what Humboldt called the highest dwelling place in the world, a low thatched hut at 13,000 feet, which belonged to a local landowner. Nestled in the folds of a gently undulating plateau, with Antisana's peak rising behind them, the hut's location was stunning. But, ill with altitude sickness, cold, and without food or even candles, the men endured one of their most miserable nights ever. That night, Carlos Montufar became so ill that Humboldt, who was sharing a bed with him, grew very worried. Throughout the night, Humboldt rose repeatedly to fetch water and administer compresses. By the morning, Montufar had recovered enough to accompany Humboldt and Bonpland on their final ascent. They made it to almost 18,000 feet, even higher, Humboldt noted with glee, than two French scientists, Charles-Marie de la Condamine and Pierre Bouguer, who had come to this part of the Andes in the 1730s to measure the shape of the earth. They had only reached just under 15,000 feet. Mountains held a spell over Humboldt. It wasn't just the physical demands or the promise of new knowledge. There was also something more transcendental. Whenever he stood on a summit or a high ridge, he felt so moved by the scenery that his imagination carried him even higher. This imagination, he said, soothed the deep wounds, the pure reason